All right, well, Jacob, we're back and going to be reacting to another video that's been pretty viral lately. The Jubilee. I can never say that right. The Jubilee Middle Grounds videos. Video: Can Mormons and ex-Mormons see eye to eye? Yeah, have you watched it yet?
I have. Not all of it, but I watched all the relevant parts for this reaction video.
Yeah. What's your overall thoughts?
I mean, I disagree with a lot of what the ex Mormons said, but I have charity for them. The one person I do not have charity for is John DeLynn, because he he set himself as an expert on certain things, like when it came to the bite model and cults, and on LGBTQ suicide, and completely misrepresented the literature. He should know better. Like, he's a professional in that field. He's published in that field. Uh, he should know better. So I do not extend grace to him. He should know better.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I watched it through, I think, twice now, beginning to end. I was actually, and I'm really thankful I didn't pursue it, but I was actually invited by at least a dozen people. They sent me the casting link to go and apply to be on the show, and I just never got around to actually doing it. But after watching it, I am pretty thankful I didn't, because it was a mess, especially on the LDS side. Now, I there's like it's hard to. I think it's the harder position to be on the LDS side, especially when they're talking about social issues. Which, again, I'm glad I wasn't there, because that's not really my thing. I don't. I care more about, did Joseph Smith have ancient golden plates, more than I do about the social issues with the church. I don't. I care more about truth claims than that. But yeah, when you're talking about the social issues with the church, it's kind of the hard part to be in defending them, because people can just say, "Oh, the church hurt me. The church did this bad," and it's like, how do you respond and defend the church in
yeah,
that scenario? It's a losing battle. It's like deciding to play basketball and you're just going to play defense the whole time. It's not very enjoyable, and it's not super productive either. But it was also messy because I think, and I actually really, I've had a couple conversations with Cardin Ellis, and I've enjoyed chatting with him. I was on a Midnight Mormons live stream a long time ago. But inviting him was also was kind of, I question that, because he has a tendency to take control and talk about himself, and do some make some interesting arguments. And yeah, I think having someone like Cardin, and then balancing it with like someone like Timber, who's super orthodox, and Cardin is just, I don't even have a word for it, and then Kwaku is a little more progressive, and then the other I can't remember her name, but yeah, it was not a, it wasn't, we're on a great recipe, and I feel like the ex Mormons shined a lot brighter than the Mormons in this one. Unfortunately, I agreed with the Latter Day Saints more, but I feel like the ex Mormons walked away from that looking really good, and the Mormons walked away look from that looking a little goofy.
yeah. I like Cardin too, but he can be a bit bombastic and suffer from the Dunning Kruger effect at times. Just I he had some good things to say, especially about cult models. I definitely agreed with him on his objection about cult models, and we'll show later on in this episode that um, the academic community actually agrees with what he said in his criticism of the bite model. So props to Cardin for bringing up that good point. I don't want to be like the like put me in, coach, but I kind of wish that I had been there to call John on some of the stuff he said, because I'm familiar with the stuff he said. I've studied it, so I could have been like, hey, you're saying stuff that isn't in line with the scholarly consensus, right? You're just kind of pushing your own agenda, but
Yeah,
it
yeah,
is
I
what it is.
definitely, I definitely think, out of everyone, I think Kwaku shined the brightest. I think he did the best job in that. But yeah, I would have liked to have seen like LDS people there, like Jasmine would have been a good one to be there. Stephen Murphy would have been a good one to be there. But again, that's just for truth claims. For social issues, you there's not a lot of people that you can put in that are going to look great in that scenario. So
Ooh. What about Jacob Hansen?
no, keep Jacob Hansen as far away from that room as possible.
I think he would have done okay. But
I actually he would have done okay. It would have been a mess. It would have been a lot more contentious, but he at least would have been confident and aware enough that he could have pushed back on some of the very bold claims that some of the ex-Mormons were making because he's familiar with some of the statistics there. But I think it would have been pretty toxic if Jacob was there.
yeah, he tends to elicit some pretty strong responses.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. Let's play the first clip where they talk about if Mormonism is a cult, and then we'll respond from there.
And the first prompt is, Mormonism is a cult.
You know, I think some of the things that are important to pay attention to are like critical things in your life that you're told how you're supposed to do them, right? Like your sexuality, the way you dress, what you eat.
What underwear you wear. What made me finally, because it was hard to admit growing up Mormon, it was hard to admit that it was a cult, but I think when you look at, again, the critical thinking, the lack of it, I think is a big red flag.
I feel like with Mormonism and growing up in that culture, which is that word right there, I had no issue stepping forward, but not necessarily to specifically focus on the negative connotation, but really just what the word is. Let's call it what it is.
I'll just speak kind of from a psychological perspective because that's my background. Does the organization, withhold information from its members with the intent of controlling the thoughts of the members? Does the organization manipulate the members through emotion? And then do they have excessive controls of behavior? And while it's deeply offensive to tell anyone they're a member of a cult, no one's going to ever say they're a member of a cult because no one thinks they're in a cult.
Okay, well, there's the ex-Mormons sitting down making claims that the church is a cult. Do you have any response to that, Jacob?
Yeah, like when it comes to like suppressing information, I like to ask these people, can they name one organization that has done anything equivalent to the Joseph Smith papers? And when I ask that, I'm not just talking, can you name like historians doing history? Because you can go to any university and find a historian or an independent historian doing history on Mormonism. What I'm referring to is that when an organization, especially a religion, deliberately publishes all the documents about their founder, Joseph Smith, or some other organization, the good and the bad, the ones that complicate their truth claims, just all of them, for the world to see. Has any other organization done that? And I'd like them to name them. And so you can cherry pick certain instances where the church didn't, like they held some information, like the 1832 First Vision. But I think when you look at our history in its totality, I mean, even if you go back to the days of B.H. Roberts, he published that 6-volume history of the church. When it comes to like the Mountain Meadows Massacre, the church has helped sponsor Richard Turley's project to publish 2 books, 2 of the best books on the subject that have ever been written, published by the Oxford University Press. So, and also like transparency, it's a pretty new cultural value, and it depends on the context as to whether it's good or not. Because like there was once upon a time when the church used to publish all the people that had been excommunicated from the church in the Deseret News. They don't do that anymore. That's transparent. But I don't think that ex-Mormon critics like John would think that that's a good thing that they did that, and they're glad that they stopped doing it. And so, I mean, there's a time and a place to be transparent. I mean, we have the government that has like top secret documents that they don't want to release because they fear that they might do damage to people's reputations that are still living, and so they're not going to release it until several decades later. I mean, there's all sorts of considerations that you have to take into account when it comes to not being transparent and withholding information. Like, it ultimately boils down to the fact that they're holding the church to a standard that we don't hold any other organization to.
Yeah, and that tends to be unfortunately pretty common, and when engaging in criticism of the church, holding it to standards. And yeah, yeah. Tangent aside, I think that's such a good point that like you brought up of not like transparency is it's not always good. There's situations where transparency can actually cause far more harm than benefit, like you brought up with the excommunications. And I remember listening to Stephen Harper on Stephen Murphy's podcast, and he was talking about Stephen Murphy asked him the question of like, what do we do about like church history that we feel like is being hid from us? And I actually really liked Stephen Harper's response, who actually is a professional historian. He talked about how there's more complexity than just like the church hiding things. There's moral questions, there's legal questions. People of like journals that we want to publish, there's people living descendants who are still have a right to with like keep that information private in those journals. And so there's a lot of loopholes, the things they have to jump through in order to publish journals and records from church leaders out to the public for transparency. And so it's far more complex than just the church is withholding information from us.
Right. And I also watched a podcast episode. It's the Standard of Truth podcast with Garrett Dirkmott. He worked on the Joseph Smith papers. And he said that like one of the reasons why it may take long for the church to publish something is because the church is getting just like boatloads of people just turning in these documents to them, like historical documents, journals from their ancestors, and going through those to see if they're authentic, to see if they're legit, not just forgeries. Like that takes a long time.
Yeah.
It takes a really long time. I don't think people who criticize the church on this understand that there may the other issues and logistics at play here. And when it comes to like something like the Council of 50 papers, like some critics say, oh, they didn't publish them until 2016, which that may have been too long. But like at the time, one of the reasons why the church didn't publish them is because the church leaders at the time that were part of the Council of 50, they said some things during those meetings. They were really mad at the federal government because of all the abuses they'd experienced. And so they said things that could be considered treasonous at the time. And they didn't want anyone getting a hold of those. And so they didn't publish them for a very long time until 2016. And I find that perfectly understandable. And I don't hold the church to a ridiculous standard because of that.
Yeah, it's just normal historical practice. Yeah, and it's like, do I want people... Like if I ask the people who criticize the church for their approach of history, I'm like, do you want to publish all your text messages and journal entries online? Are you comfortable with that right now? Because that's the complexity of what the church is going through as they're digging through these private documents that were intended to be private a lot of times, as they're going to publish them. Like it's just a far more complex than what John Dehlin and many other exmo critics of the church are willing to admit. So, yeah, you have any other thoughts before we continue on?
No, I think that Quakers' criticism is that like a lot of their criticism about critical thinking, like you can just like the purpose of a cult model is to distinguish nefarious organizations from good organizations, from illegitimate organizations from legitimate organizations. And so like you can find the problems they're talking about in any group, and so you have to show that this problem is exceptionally bad within the Mormon church compared to the general population or other organizations in order to even talk about this.
Yeah, and we'll get into the cult models here in just a second. Right. After we let's let them keep going here.
When I think of a cult, I think of an organization that's really controlling, and they don't let you exercise freedom or autonomy. They control how you think. They control what you say and how you say it. But if I look at Mormon culture expansively, I don't see people that are controlled. I feel like the word cult, I mean, if you break it down to mean at some point someone suggested that I live my life a certain way, then everything's a cult. And if everything's a cult, then nothing's a cult.
There are many members of the church who have this mindset that when the prophet speaks, the debate is over and you should just not think about it. And that's not right. Honestly, I think that is cultish. But that is not what the church has taught over time.
I think, though, that you are told, seek your own answer, pray, but if it differs from what the prophet is saying, then you might be being deceived by Satan or you got the wrong answer. It should ultimately align with what the prophet is saying. And that's why they say, read the Book of Mormon, pray, see if it's true for yourself. And if you don't get an answer, pray harder, go talk to someone, have more experiences, try again, until you get the right answer that it's true. So I think it's a little disingenuous to say that you can seek truth on your own that doesn't align with the prophet, because that doesn't generally just seem to be how it goes.
Yeah, but that completely goes in the face of, I was a missionary for 2 years, and the number one message we do when we present the Book of Mormon and Mormonism at large to somebody is the infamous Moroni's promise. We say, go home, pray about it. You need to develop a relationship with God that is so unique and strong that you can recognize when He is talking to you, whether or not this is the path you're supposed to take. The idea that Mormonism is a cult is a pejorative trope that has been an anti-Mormon slur against the church for a long time. And I always ask, by what rubric? You mentioned the bite model before, and I've seen that you've interviewed Stephen Hassan on your show, and he's given a rubric. Well, that same author has called anybody that voted for Donald Trump a cult. He wrote an entire book about the cult of Trump. And if you apply any of these bite model methodologies or any of these cult definitions, my show choir in high school was a cult. Apple is a cult. Wait until the next Star Wars movie comes out. It's a cult. That word is used in the same way, with the same inefficacy and the inability to back it up, unless you use people that, unfortunately, in your case, were not actually being truly Mormon.
Stephen Hassan would agree that Apple can have some of the traits of a cult, or the military, or an educational institution, or a corporation, but he also has a harm continuum, a continuum of harm. And if you add up all the deaths of the People's Temple, Jim Jones, of any of the cults you mentioned, it won't add up to the number of LGBT youth in the Mormon Church that have killed themselves. And so we can talk about just severity of, children are cut off, some children are homeless because their parents kick them out. Now, I'll admit, the Mormon Church does a lot of good for a lot of people. But if you just add up the amount of harm, I think that's when it goes from just a silly trope to a very serious conversation.
I can't vouch and say that an organization as large as the LDS Church doesn't have any damage. Obviously, people can do damage, but at the same token, if we hold every organization to a standard that implies they can't have any sort of cultural stains that the entire country has struggled with, well, good luck. And as someone who believes in Jesus Christ, my hope and my goal is we can get rid of it. We can get rid of that out of our church eventually. But that is not a unique Mormon problem. That is a problem that was given to us by the generations that came before, the generations that said separate water fountains, the generations that said, oh, you're gay, you should be going to camp, whether it's a Baptist, Mormons, whatever. That stuff is evil. But does that evil make us uniquely evil, or is that a Western American problem that has permeated these organizations?
Okay, so there's the next clip, and I think that portion is actually where the Mormons throughout this video shine the brightest. I think the pushback that they gave to John about how this is about how cults are like the models that he uses to determine cults can be applied to so many organizations throughout the world, and then John claiming that cult equals harm, and then Kwaku giving the pushback that the great pushback that like we have millions of church members, of course there's harm that's going to be happening. We have to look at it on a global or like a percentage basis. So I don't know, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, when John says that, like, these organizations can meet components of the bite model, but there are harmful cults and there's non-harmful cults. And when he says that, he's basically admitting that it's possible to meet all the components of the bite model and not be harmful? And my answer to that is, okay, then why do we need your model? It's like if meeting the criteria doesn't predict harm, then what does the model tell us that's useful? Can't we just assess harm of an organization independent of the bite model and go with that? We can conduct studies of the effects of these organizations. If they're harmful, they're bad. If they're not harmful, they're good. Why do we need the bite model if it doesn't predict harm? And by the way, like, is he really going to argue that organizations like Apple aren't harmful? Like, they have sweatshops in Asia. Like,
Yeah.
but that dumb excuse you just came up with just confirms, okay, well, Apple's harmful then. But, and when it comes to the military, is he going to argue that's not harmful? It's literally their job to harm people. Like, but and all my buddies, when I was in the Army Reserves, I was never deployed, but I met people who were. They suffer from PTSD, all sorts of injuries. Some of them got their legs blown off. They have constant ringing in their ears because they were around mortar fire or tank fire or gunfire all the time. Suffering from all sorts of stuff. Like, there were so many guys that committed suicide in my unit that had been deployed, and we had to go to their memorial services and everything. Like, but the thing is that when you bring that up, people like John and Stephen Hassan try to find these post hoc reasons to say, okay, well, that's an exception. That doesn't count. And it's not applied in a consistent way. And I think the reason for this is because these organizations, like, they would argue that the good outweighs the bad, even though they do harm people. They hold a legitimate place in our society, and they're respected. Whereas cults, that some would say the LDS Church is a cult, don't. But the thing is that these organizations were already hated before cult models came along. And so it kind of just seems like you're trying to find pseudoscientific reasons to justify your biases against this religion rather than scientifically analyze the dynamics that are going on.
Yeah. Would you say that Cardin's pushback was accurate too? Does the military meet the criteria of the bite model? Does a high school choir or high school sports team, or Apple and companies or Weight Watchers, do those things meet the criteria of the bite model? Is that accurate?
Oh yeah, he's spot on. And this is a criticism that that the academic community has of cult models, and we can actually get into what they said. So if I can give that whole presentation on it if you want right now, unless you want to talk about something else.
No, yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Okay, sweet. So in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was the anti-cult movement. They were really big back then, and they had a lot more free reign to do what they wanted, because the courts hadn't told them to knock it off yet. But the main ringleader among the scholars that accepted these cult models was Margaret Singer. And if you read Stephen Hassan's dissertation, he relies heavily upon her work. So he's going to argue that his work is new and improved and more nuanced, but like he's relying upon the work of psychologists and social scientists whose work was completely repudiated back in the 90s in several court cases. So just corrupt tree all around. So basically Margaret Singer and the anti-cult movement, they would sue organizations like Scientology or the United Pentecostal Church or the Unification Church, some call them Moonies, because they had some teenagers and college students that were joining them, and their family would become alarmed, and their families would claim that these groups brainwash these kids, and therefore they need to be legally held accountable for it.
Yeah, and there's a couple clips from Dan McClellan and then another scholar, and even some clips on the Mormon Stories podcast that I think actually validates what you were just saying right there.
Hey everybody, I continue to see a lot of discussion on social media about cults, and I just want to remind you all that this is not a legitimate scholarly framework. Cult, brainwashing, mind control, deprogramming, these things were all abandoned by scholars back in the early 90s after the courts asked cult experts to substantiate their methods and their findings, and they failed entirely. This is why the only scholars you will see publishing on the concept of cult these days are scholars from the 80s who are trying to remain relevant. So Stephen Hassan's BITE model was developed back in '88. It was abandoned by scholars along with everything else, but after 9/11, after the rise of Trump, these scholars try to ride that wave of populist anxiety back into the public eye. And this is harmful for a number of reasons, and not least of which, it complicates our attempts to understand what's actually going on with these groups that are causing significant harm. Hey, happy to elaborate. The conceptualization of cult that I critique in my video is a product of the 1960s and the development of two social movements in tandem that were made up of parents who were upset about their teenage and adult children running off into the woods with hippies to talk about weird stuff. In the Christian community, you had the counter-cult movement. In the non-religious community, you had the anti-cult movement. And one of their priorities was finding a way to assert control over their adult children who could join any groups they wanted. And what they did to facilitate that was went to long since debunked research about Korean War POWs and how they had to have been brainwashed and been under mind control to sympathize with their captors. This has long since been debunked, but the counter and anti-cult movement gladly took up that research and said people who join with these weirdos in the woods cannot be of sound mind. They must have been brainwashed. They are under mind control. This allowed them to get medical professionals involved. It allowed them to commit people. It allowed them to take over control of the lives of their adult children, which was the goal all along. Now, because brainwashing isn't real, deprogramming, their method of reversing the effects of brainwashing, also wasn't real. So they were constantly having to escalate their techniques to try to make it work. And this resulted in the 80s with a bunch of kidnappings, with sexual abuse, with electroshock therapy, and a lot of harmful behavior that mirrored what they were criticizing in the cults themselves. So scholars began to become alarmed. They started to investigate the foundations of these frameworks and found out that there was nothing there. There was no scientific basis to brainwashing, to mind control. And the bottom fell out. The courts stopped allowing them to use brainwashing and mind control as a way to absolve themselves of responsibility for their actions. And by 1995, these movements were all but defunct, which is why you don't see scholars these days talking about cults and mind control, except for scholars like Stephen Hassan from the 80s trying to relive the glory days. The rise of Trump increased interest among lay people and society in general about cults, and this allowed him to ride that populist wave into a PhD program where he finally wrote his dissertation and got his PhD in 2020, even though the BITE model dates to the 80s. Now, this is not to say that such groups were not capable of harmful behavior and that there were not power dynamics and different techniques of manipulation that led to harmful behavior. There were absolutely such harmful behaviors, but the dynamics associated with them are not found in this conceptualization of cult. They're much broader, and we need to do better to understand them.
Yeah, that's not true, my friend.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. It doesn't mean every single person who is a scholar agrees, but it is overwhelmingly the consensus, and the argument is sound.
Here's a class you can take at Harvard University on cult psychology.
Yes, universities, including Harvard, still have courses like this on the books. These are courses that the university has and assigns to professors who, for the most part, are not specialists in this and are teaching it only because they're capable of teaching this. And for instance, if you go look at the professors who teach this course at Harvard and have taught it in the past and look at their CVs, you will not find the word cult anywhere in their publications or in their research. They tend not to be specialists in new religious movements. But if you look at the specialists in new religious movements that Harvard does have, you will find them saying cult is an outdated term. We don't use this. Deprogramming, brainwashing are not a thing. However, we do recognize that a lot of people use cult because that it helps them make sense of their past experiences. And so they will respect that term even though they don't prefer it, they don't use it in the scholarship, and they don't think of it as a legitimate scholarly framework. So it's a lot more complicated than this. I am sharing the overwhelming academic consensus. I am not telling you every last scholar on the planet believes this, and if anyone doesn't, they're lying.
The only people who don't think it's a legitimate study are people in cults. Like if you belong to the Mormon church. Which, let's get real, that's what this is really about, right?
No, that's not remotely what this is about, but I understand that that is an easy assumption to make. I am sharing the overwhelming academic consensus. You can look at a bunch of resources to find this out. You can look at the journal Nova Religio. You can look at the International Journal for the Study of New Religions. You can go look at the Oxford Handbook of New Religious Movements. Rutledge has a whole series on new religious movements. Cambridge does as well. You can find all kinds of scholarship out there that demonstrates what I'm sharing is the scholarly consensus. But to suggest that because Harvard has a course with the word cult in the title and in the course description means that no one thinks this is an inappropriate scholarly category except for those who are in cults is just laughably lazy. Please do better.
Perhaps I should be flattered that you called me a cult apologist, and I wouldn't bother responding except sometimes on social media if you say something enough people start to believe it. Scholars refrain from disparaging or condemning religious groups, and that's why we use a term like new religious movement rather than cult. Scholars don't deny that there can be abuse, manipulation, and corruption in all sorts of new religious movements, as well as older religious movements. Cult is a poorly defined, biased term that is associated with some outdated, even unscientific notions, like brainwashing. I'm not an apologist for my own religion, so I'm certainly not going to be one for new religious movements. When it comes to publishing in academic journals and doing scientific research, I'm confident that the scholars in new religious movements outnumber by far those who are in the anti-cult movement. So there isn't parity between these two groups. I'm not doubting that you have suffered from your family's involvement in the Unification Church, but I want to show you that there are plenty of religious scholars who do study the Unification Church without calling them a cult, and so I'll show you some images from the articles that have been published in recent years.
The other thing that came out in the 60s was a resurgence of anxiety about so-called brainwashing. Now, brainwashing has no psychological basis, but it arose during the Korean War as a way of fomenting fears about POWs. But this was given a whole new life with during the 60s and 70s with the deprogrammer movement. That is, experts in evil, in this case, experts who could kidnap your child from a group and subject your child to extreme deprivation and violence in order to convince him or her that they shouldn't be part of the group. And the idea was that what they claimed, the deprogrammers, was that they were breaking the brainwashing that the group did. Brainwashing became an important aspect of the satanic ritual abuse claims. The idea was that these rituals functioned to hypnotize and brainwash the abuse victims. So not only were they victims of sexual abuse, they were victims of programming and deprogramming, programming and brainwashing. So I would say that was one major thread that came into SRA. And the other was the notion of the cult itself. The cult as a kind of folk model of dangerous religion. I don't use the word cult when I teach, and even when I teach about new religious movements, I don't let I try to get the students away from the word cult. I tell them at a certain point that they have to learn not to use the word cult because it's
Polarizing, divisive.
It's derogatory, and of course, LDS members will know that, in the broader evangelical society, LDS is viewed as a cult. It's really a word that means any form of religion that is
That you don't like.
Yeah, you don't like, exactly.
A cult is a religion I don't like.
Exactly, yes. But that became important for the satanic ritual abuse thing, because now the satanic cult becomes the worst kind.
Right. Okay.
And so we already showed the videos from Dan McClellan and Dr. Hillel Gray kind of giving a synopsis of the history of these cult models and how they're viewed in the scientific community. So I'm going to go into more of the particulars about what happened during these court cases. The main ones would be the Molko case and the U.S. versus Fishman case. And what was on trial here was basically the concept of brainwashing. Can it be used in court? And so the American Psychological Association and the American Sociological Association, they filed what are called amicus briefs, where basically they write their opinion as an organization about what they think about the concept of brainwashing. And so I'm going to read what several psychologists and social scientists had to say about Margaret Singer's theories. So the first one is by Dr. Jeffrey D. Fisher. So in his report, he wrote that Margaret Singer's work, her report on brainwashing, is unscientific in tone and biased in nature, sometimes characterized by the use of deceptive indirect techniques of persuasion and control, the very thing it is investigating. At times, wrote Fisher, the reasoning seems flawed to the point of being almost ridiculous. Fisher added that the historical excursion on the cults reads more like hysterical ramblings than a scientific task force report. Fisher commented that the reasoning becomes absolutely some of the most polemical, ridiculous reasoning I've ever seen anywhere, much less in the context of an APA technical report. And then a Jewish scholar, his name is Biat Halamni. He's sympathetic to the anti-cult movement because he thinks that these groups can be harmful. But when it came to the concept of brainwashing, he says the term brainwashing is not a recognized theoretical concept and is just a sensationalist explanation more suitable to cultists and revival preachers. It should not be used by psychologists since it is not to explain anything. And then this is where they actually agree with what Cardin said. Dr. Catherine Grady, she said, according to Dr. Catherine Grady, the coercive persuasion techniques used in the task force estimate by the religious movements are not defined and cannot be distinguished from methods used in advertising, elementary schools, mainline churches, Alcoholics Anonymous, and Weight Watchers. So she's basically pointing out that there's all these legitimate organizations out there that are respected by society that use these same tactics. And so how do they tell us anything useful about these cults, like other than be like a smokescreen for your own biases? So, and then in the amicus brief on the 10th of September, February 1987, the APA and others filed an amicus brief in the Molko case. The brief stated that the theory Margaret Singer had labeled coercive persuasion is not accepted in the scientific community, and that the corresponding methodology has been repudiated by the scientific community. The brief went on to specify that the choice of labels among brainwashing, mental manipulation, and coercive persuasion, always in the meaning used by Singer, was irrelevant, for none of these theories could be considered to be scientific. Now this is important because in Hassan's bite model, you have like information, behavior, emotional control. And the control part, the way he operationalizes control, is very similar to the way Margaret Singer and other brainwashing scholars operationalize brainwashing, coercive persuasion, mind control, mental slavery, whatever you want to call it. They go by different names. And so he's basically saying that these organizations are controlling your behavior, your emotions, information, using these coercive persuasion brainwashing techniques. And once you realize that he's basing it off of these debunked theories, that these organizations aren't actually controlling you, what you have in Stephen Hassan's bite model is just basically a big wish list. And I have an acquaintance, I don't want to give his name, but he's actually talked to Stephen Hassan, and he put it really well. He said that Hassan conflates his own progressive Jewish humanism with what he thinks a healthy religion should look like. I mean, which is fine, but that's just your opinion. And you need to justify your opinion with evidence. Like, okay, is this really what a healthy religion should look like? Like, you need to justify that. But in my experience engaging with Hassan's work and other people who promote his work, they don't feel like they need to justify that. They just assume that this is what a healthy religion should look like, and that if an organization meets this criteria, then it's an unhealthy religion. Well, okay, you need to justify why that criteria is what constitutes a healthy religion, because a lot of people don't agree with that. And there are plenty of organizations like the LDS Church that do meet a lot of that criteria and have been shown in the social science literature to be a very healthy pro-social religion. There are, like, I've talked about this before, but there are 158 studies that have been conducted between 1960 and 2022 on the subject of Mormonism and mental health. And they measure it in different ways. They either measure mental health directly or happiness directly, or factors that correlate with happiness. And what they found is that the vast majority of these studies find that the Mormon Church has a positive influence on society and on the mental health of its members. And this squares really well with the general religion and health literature. Right here I have is the Handbook of Religion and Health by Harold Koenig, Tyler Vanderweel, and John Petit. It was published last year, so it's very recent, and it's basically just a review of thousands of studies that have been published in the past few decades on the subject of religion and health. And what it shows is that, like, religiosity, intrinsic religiosity especially, is very healthy for you. And it also shows that you don't necessarily have to meet Hassan's criteria for what constitutes a healthy religion in order to be a healthy religion. So I definitely recommend people actually check out the religion and health literature rather than just assuming that Hassan's criteria is what a healthy religion should look like. He's basically just saying, if this church doesn't meet, like, it doesn't agree with my identity politics, then it's not a healthy religion, which is ridiculous. So, to speak more on Hassan and his history, I just want to read off a few quotes from a good book. It's called Brainwashing, Reality or Myth. It was published by the Cambridge University Press by Massimo Intravigne. He's a sociologist and social historian. I'd recommend reading the book. What he had to say about Stephen Hassan is self-styled cult experts who had been active in deprogramming, such as Stephen Hassan and Rick Ross, also lecture internationally and keep alive Margaret Singer's model. As late as 2020, Hassan was still promoting the classic theory of brainwashing, and even Singer's idea that it had been marginalized in academia through a conspiracy of scholars who were paid by the cults. In his History of the Academic Study of New Religious Movements, W. Michael Ashcraft noted that a handful of scholars seceded from the majority of their colleagues to create a new discipline they called cultic studies. This branch accepts the distinction between religions and cults and identifies cults by their use of heavy psychological manipulation techniques, for which some scholars retain the word brainwashing. As Ashcraft observed, cultic studies was never accepted as mainstream scholarship. It continued as a project shared by a small cadre of committed scholars, but not endorsed by the larger academic community nationally and internationally. Now, what I forgot to say earlier is that after Margaret Singer and her colleagues lost big in the courts, what they basically did is they broke off from mainstream academia and they created their own academic journals. So if you see an academic journal with the word cult or cultic studies in it, it's likely those people. And that camp, they argue that there's like this conspiracy in mainstream academia to suppress their work. And it's basically them acknowledging that no one takes them seriously, but they don't want to admit that their work is trash, so they cry conspiracy instead. And Stephen Hassan, if you read his dissertation and what he says on Twitter, he believes that. He believes that his work is being marginalized by academia, that he's being persecuted, like blah, blah, blah. Like, yeah, no one takes you seriously, Stephen. So, to go a little more into Stephen Hassan's history, so he was part of an organization called Cult Awareness Network. This organization has a very, very shady history. So Stephen Hassan was a former member of Reverend Moon's Unification Church, and also Rick Ross. He is also involved in the anti-cult movement. Had been convicted of burglary and grand theft before discovering that posing as a self-styled specialist in cults and offering deprogramming services was less dangerous than robbing jewelry stores, an activity he had engaged in before reinventing himself as a cult expert. So on the 10th of January 1975, Ross was charged for attempted burglary and pleaded guilty in exchange of an agreement lowering the charge to conspiracy. On July 23rd, 1975, Ross, with a store clerk as an accomplice, was able to steal 306 pieces of jewelry from a Phoenix shop, pretending he had a bomb in a box ready to detonate. On the 2nd of April 1976, he was sentenced to 4 years in jail for the robbery. Without stopping to think whether their actions might in turn be illegal, these deprogrammers lured members of new religious movements into their parents' homes under the various pretexts, sometimes even kidnapping them in the streets or in their religious group's residences. They shut them for days in hotels or isolated houses, bombarding them with negative information about the group, hoping to decondition them and reverse the effects of brainwashing. Eventually, a lot of the religions like Scientology and the United Pentecostals that were being affected by cult awareness networks deprogramming, they punched back, and they managed to make sure that the cult awareness network's assets were seized by a judge, and they were put on auction and purchased by Scientologists who deposited them into a public library, opening them to scholars. Then a leading sociologist named Andrew Shoup guided a team who studied these documents and told the crazy story of the cult awareness network's involvement in illegal deprogramming, a story that involved also Margaret Singer and Stephen Hassan. Hassan was subsequently accused of unethical conduct in his deprogramming business and of charging truly exorbitant sums for his activities by voices from within the anti-cult community itself. So he had people in the anti-cult community accusing him of just charging ridiculous sums and just basically making money off of his bunk deprogramming and everything. If brainwashing's not real, deprogramming also isn't real. So he's just basically making money off of something that is based off of a bad theory. These deprogramming sessions could be extremely abusive. There was sexual abuse, just locking people in rooms and just all sorts of crazy stuff. Now, the courts eventually told the anti-cult movement in the United States to knock it off, and so they have to be a lot more discreet. If they do conduct deprogramming, they have to be very careful. They don't use the coercive methods they do anymore. And Stephen Hassan would claim, well, I don't do that anymore. I've changed. Well, yeah, dude, that's because the courts told you to knock it off. Had they not, I don't know if he would have stopped. And the United States, we're lucky. We have very strong religious freedom protections, and we had the courts that were able to kind of rein in the anti-cult movement. But if you look in Europe and in Asia, the anti-cult movement is still very alive and well in countries that don't have these religious freedom protections. And they've used concepts like brainwashing to get the government to limit the rights and resort to persecuting small new religious movements in those countries. For example, China, they have a list of religions that aren't allowed in their country, and they basically say we don't allow them because they're cults, and they use brainwashing models and everything as a justification for that. And we see in Russia, in countries where you have a dominant religion like the Russian Orthodox Church, they often see smaller religions like the Mormon Church and Jehovah's Witnesses as a threat to their dominance in the country. And so there were some high ups in the Russian Orthodox Church that played a very big role in the European anti-cult movement, that also played a very big role in convincing the Russian government to completely kick the Jehovah's Witnesses out of Russia. And I know people who served missions during that time. This happened a few years ago, but they saw police barging into people's homes, dragging them out of their houses. The Jehovah's Witnesses aren't allowed to operate in Russia anymore. And our church, like, we're severely limited now as to what we can do. Like, we can't openly proselyte. Luckily, our church is much more willing to compromise and play ball with totalitarian governments like Putin. But the Jehovah's Witnesses are not. They're not very compromising. They're pretty dogmatic about not participating in the military, not compromising with governments, and so they just got completely kicked out. And the anti-cult movement played a very big role in that. And even in places like France or Italy, like the Catholic Church has a very strong influence, and so you've had people trying to persecute new religious movements in those countries. France is a very secular country, and they've tried to use brainwashing and cult models as a way to limit the religious freedom of smaller religions there. And to close off, in 2020, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, which is a bipartisan commission of the U.S. federal government, they identified the anti-cult ideology as a major threat to international religious liberty. This may seem silly to us now because the anti-cult movement doesn't have as much power in the United States like they used to because the courts told them to knock it off. But if our country were to give them more free rein to do what they wanted, you need only look to Europe to see what it would be like if the anti-cult movement had their way. And so, like, I just think people need to be aware of the history of the anti-cult movement in the United States and what they're currently doing in other countries now. Like the Uyghur Muslims, the ones that are being put in concentration camps by China, like they're considered a cult by China, and that's one of the reasons why they're persecuting them and treating them the way they do. So people just need to be aware of just how bad this movement can be if they're given the freedom to do what they want.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a lot of good information. If I could summarize it, and you tell me where I go wrong, but if I could give it back to you. So, Stephen Hassan's work is built at its foundation upon Margaret Singer's work, which includes the pseudoscience of brainwashing and mind control, which suggests that organizations can essentially brainwash and control you to participate in certain behaviors and think a certain way, thus restricting your ability to function as a normal human being. Is that right?
Pretty much, yeah, that's a good synopsis. I know, like, I took a while, but I just wanted to make sure and cover my bases and show, like, people.
No, yeah, you did fantastic. And so his work is built upon that, and then he takes, and then that work back in like the 80s and 90s, is that right? Was condemned by the vast majority of scientists of religion and psychology. That that field of pseudoscience was condemned and pushed off to the side by the actual scientific community. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, and then they created their own academic journals and their own things to try to feel credible and to seem credible. And during that time, Stephen Hassan also teams up with Rick Ross, who was a jewel thief of some kind. Yeah. He teams up with Rick Ross, who is a jewel thief, and he starts charging really excessive amounts of money to deprogram people to get them out of their mind control and their brainwashing, which is pseudoscience. But he starts charging them to get rid of that for them, and charging crazy amounts of money that even his own cult movement community that accepts his work were condemning him for charging those prices for. And even during those sessions, there was a lot of controversy with his behavior as well as the behavior of those around him. Is that right?
Basically, yeah. Good synopsis.
Okay. And then, so he kind of, their movement starts to fall, but then Trumpism comes around. He rides that wave, as Dan McClellan was talking about, rides that wave back up to popularity, to where now the anti-cult movement is probably has a bigger voice than it should, and that is very problematic and harmful because people will use his arbitrary cult model, the bite model, which is essentially just his ideas on what makes a religion helpful, but isn't actually have any scientific backing, has the same amount of scientific backing as Jacob Hansen's collective witness model. It's just what he wants, you know? Yeah, so he just this arbitrary model that can apply to any organization ever. And that people who use that model to say this religion I don't like is a cult, it justifies them to hold bigoted opinions towards that religion and pass legislation to marginalize and hurt them. Is
Yeah,
that accurate?
and then yeah, and then like because they have this model, it can give like the appearance that they're just saying it's just science, bro. Like I'm I'm
Yeah.
I'm justifying my bigoted opinions with science.
Okay.
Um,
And
and then
all of this is built on the foundation of nonsensical pseudoscience that is universally practically condemned by all credible psychologists of religion and brain functioning. Right?
right, and like it should be noted, like also like religious studies scholars, sociologists, historians, folklore experts, um, and also psychologists and psychiatrists. The reason why the APA had to be so vocal is because the field of study that the anti-cult movement has had the most pull in, the most influence, even though it's still marginal, is in psychology and psychiatry. Um, the other fields didn't feel the need to repudiate what they were saying because like they didn't take them seriously in the first place. And so the American
Okay.
Psychological Association had to vocally just say, look, we do not take this seriously because like the anti-cult movement had the most influence in their field. And so they were just trying to distance themselves from them and say, hey, look, we don't take them seriously. And so and even today within the field of psychology and psychiatry, that's where it's taken the most seriously, even though it's still not taken very seriously. But in the other ones I named, it's never been taken seriously at all.
Yeah. And I saw, to bring up your point about how Stephen Hassan and Margaret Singer in that community act like anyone who disagrees with them is just part of like a conspiracy against them, like just kind of like this crazy paranoid thinking, right? I saw Dan McClellan, Stephen Hassan respond to Dan McClellan's criticism of his bite model and the anti cult movement and everything. And he basically said that Dan McClellan was employed and like commissioned by the church to challenge his model, and the church is like basically forcing him and brainwashing him to do this. And I just think you have to be such a Looney Tune. It's like Stephen Hassan is such a the fact that John goes and brands him, and we as we've seen, John's had people on his show that have already demonstrated that cult models are nonsense or pseudoscience. And the fact that John continues to promote and he posts pictures saying that him, Stephen Hassan, and Kara are cult slayers, as they posted on Facebook and everything. And he's promoting his work when Stephen Hassan is just this nut job who thinks that anyone who challenges his work is like a conspiracy against him and they're fighting against the anti cult movement. Like, oh my gosh, I can't even. It's ridiculous. Like, what are you doing, John?
Yeah. He's an activist and a crusader, not a scholar. Same thing as John.
He's a nut job. It's
Yeah.
at his core.
So just to kind of close on this, if you go through all the different like criteria under all the different categories of behavior, emotional, and information control, he has like little like criteria of what an organization should meet, and then they meet the bite model. I went through that criteria, and there's some of them where you're like, okay, yeah, that's obviously a bad thing, like who using force or threats of force to get people to comply with your orders or whatever. Which even in some contexts that's not wrong. The military does that. Police do that. So even that's contextual. But the other characteristics, I'm going through them one by one. I'm like, yeah, my church does that, but so what?
Yeah,
I don't.
so does your
I,
social groups.
Yeah, and I'm like, so what? Like, it's highly contextual on whether that is wrong. Like, there was one that says that like this organization tells you who, where, and when you should have sex with someone, and it was like, okay, our church tells us marriage is between a man and a woman. They strongly encourage that you get married in the temple. Like, it meets that criteria, and I'm just like, I mean, so what? I don't see
Yeah,
that as a bad thing.
schools have taught that numerous times too. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's crazy.
But yeah,
Yeah,
you can go through that list and find us, if you can find a situation or many situations in which doing that is perfectly fine, depending on the context, then what use is your model? Like, because people think that if you meet that criteria, that's prima facie evidence that you're a cult and that you're bad. But
yeah.
the thing is, you can find many contexts where the vast majority of people in society wouldn't think that's bad, or like a substantial percentage, even if they're the minority, doesn't think it's bad. Like there's plenty of socially conservative religions like the Seventh-day Adventists, our church, evangelicals. They do a lot of the things that are in the Bite model, but they don't agree that it's bad. And so again, he's just trying to pass off his own progressive left-wing identity politics as like this is what a healthy religion should look like, and there's definitely not consensus on that.
And even like so that we've established the Bite model is overly vague, built upon nonsensical pseudoscience, right? But isn't it even debatable among Stephen Hassan's own community that the LDS Church fits the criteria of the Bite model?
Yeah. There's even among this small minority of cult scholars who are marginalized and aren't taken seriously by academia, even among them, there isn't agreement as to whether the LDS Church meets the criteria of the Bite model or if it's a cult. So even if you just completely limit yourself to those scholars, you don't really have a case against our church.
So when people are calling our church a cult and using Stephen Hassan's Bite model to justify that, they're making a claim based on nonsensical pseudoscience, and they're making the claim towards our church that isn't even agreed upon among the people who even accept that pseudoscience. So it's basically just a twofold, pretty debunked, ridiculous claim to use that.
Pretty much. Yeah, pretty much.
There you go. Yeah. Stupid word. Cult is a stupid word. So Should we continue, or do you have anything else to add there?
Nope, I think we're good.
All right, so now we'll play what's probably the most viral part of the Jubilee's episode, and we'll go from there.
No, I completely understand. We live in a hypersexualized society, and I think that is very, very difficult for gay, lesbian, transgender members of the church, and so on and so forth. And just as Timber said, the Lord in his infinite mercy does not spare any of us from trials. But this idea that, I don't want to say that their trial is unique, because it is unique, but I look at it a little bit differently. I have leukemia. My illness will kill me 20 years earlier than Timber. You don't think on my deathbed, forgive me, you don't think that I wouldn't trade a little bit of Timber's gayness for 20 years extra on this earth? So if Timber has a loss of faith because being gay in a hypersexualized world with a law of chastity from the Bible that he doesn't understand, I get that, because we live in a cruel, hypersexualized world. But I stare down the barrel of a chemotherapy pill every day that keeps me alive. I will die probably the same time my father does. It's a trial, and it sucks, but welcome to the club. That's why.
I have to stop you right there. To say that being gay is a trial is disgusting. That is offensive.
You don't
That is
think
like
dying
saying-
early is disgusting to me?
Let her finish.
I am saying that the way that the church sees people being born gay is like being born with cancer.
I think she was more upset that you basically
To
codified it
refer
as an illness.
as
No,
a
I'm saying if you
trial
have a
sort of-
loss
No,
of
no, 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 no.
faith because of it.
Being gay is not a trial. Being gay in the church is a trial because of how they treat you and how they see it. How they see gay people is like being born with cancer. They're like, we're so sorry you were born this way. You can be that way, but don't do anything about it. I went to BYU. I took tests where they said, they had asked questions like, how do we treat members of the LGBTQ community? And the answer was to love them unconditionally, but understand that they will never be truly as happy as those who follow the Mormon religion. And so that is so painful to read and see, because the trial isn't being gay. Actually, being gay is incredible. being attracted to someone of the same sex is beautiful, and I've never been happier. The trial comes when the church tells you that that is wrong, and hopefully when you die, that cancer of being gay will be gone.
Okay, so there it is. I cannot tell you how many times I have seen that clip on TikTok just circulating around and people stitching it, and I think that was messy. I'm not a fan of using an illness like that to try to benefit your argument. I also don't know if I really fully agree with the point he was trying to make. I understand it. But I feel like Jillian kind of wiped the floor with him there a little bit. I think that was kind of an inappropriate thing to bring up in that context, and I think she rightly pointed that out and pointed the flaws in his argument. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but that was pretty messy.
I remember watching a reaction video from Wired Radio, and Cardin said that they cut out some context, certain things he said that made him look worse than he actually was. He was addressing other issues other than just being gay. And so, like, given the benefit of the doubt that maybe if we had seen the entire thing, it wouldn't have looked as bad.
Yeah.
And also, like, Jillian's point is she tries to argue that, being gay isn't a trial. Being gay in the church is a trial. And her argument is based on the assumption that gay LGBTQ people in the church are worse off than those outside the church. And that's just not what the data shows.
Yeah.
See, when it comes to like suicide and the mental health of sexual minorities in the church, what we have to understand is that our country is currently going through a suicide epidemic. And the suicide rates of sexual minorities has always been several times that of the general population. And this is true no matter where you go, no matter what country you go to. If you go to the Nordic countries, and who have been accepting of LGBTQ people much longer than any other country, I would argue, they're much higher there too. If you go to San Francisco, which is like the gay capital of the U.S., their suicide rates are similar to that of LGBTQ people in Utah. And so what we see is that there's this baseline of human suffering that goes on in the world, nationally and internationally. And so if you want to argue that the church is harmful, you have to show, does the church aggravate that problem, make it worse than it already is through its teachings, or does it mitigate those problems? And as we'll go into later, when John DeLynn gives his spiel, the church, there's actually some good evidence that the church mitigates that problem among heterosexual members of the church and even LGBTQ members of the church. And so she doesn't have a point here. Again, I'm not trying to just shut her down. Not like, I don't want to downplay her personal experiences, but she is making a general claim about the church's effects. And so I am making a general claim based on the data.
Awesome. Yeah, and you bring it up. I think let's, John continues to make a claim, and we'll play a clip and then probably a couple other snippets. A claim about LGBTQ suicides in the church. So, yeah, let's play that clip and then we'll go from there.
That's
I disagree. I think we all have equal opportunity for happiness. I think happiness looks different for other people. And I can say that I had a semblance of happiness when I was with my boyfriends. And
but are you saying she's not really happy?
No.
Are you saying her happiness is fake?
I'm not. I believe you are truly happy. And
do you think she'll need to change fundamentally who she is as a person when we're talking about the next life in order to get that happiness that you're bringing to the table?
I believe the Christian doctrine that sexual expression should only be between a man and a woman. But that, again, that's not an LDS doctrine.
So will Mormon Heavenly Father keep her out of the celestial kingdom if she continues to have gay relationships?
Well, he's not.
Wait, I asked him.
I am saying that
That's a yes or no. That's a yes or no.
Do I believe that Heavenly Father would keep her out of the celestial kingdom if she
If she continues to have lesbian relationships? through her entire life and doesn't repent for them.
Yes, I believe that. Yes, but
He'll keep her out of heaven. Celestial kingdom. Celestial kingdom.
No.
Celestial kingdom.
Yes, we all have a standard that we need.
She won't be able to live with her family forever, which is the
Or with
Mormon
a spouse.
promise.
No, but that's
Because-
that's
because-
abuse
Hold on,
of the
hold on,
doctrine
hold on.
of eternal
Hold on. Keep going.
I mean, I believe Jesus is clear in the scriptures that there is a certain way to be able to return to the Father, and we have to be willing to sacrifice everything. He says that we need to lay down our lives, deny ourselves to follow Him in order to go to heaven. And whether you believe it's the celestial kingdom or heaven or whatever it is, there is a standard that we need to live by.
That standard, it also applies to several other religions. I just don't want that to get confused that it's specifically our Mormon
Well,
religion.
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, exactly. It's several other religions. It's not just
Just because
This
just
panel
believe it
is
doesn't
about
mean
the
it's
LDS
right.
Church, though. We definitely can talk about the issues with the LDS Church.
There's two ways to be accepted in the Mormon Church. If you're gay, you either can be celibate or you can enter into a mixed orientation marriage. And I can tell you that there's like a 70% divorce rate for mixed orientation marriages. Let me just finish. It is true.
That is not true.
So I have a PhD in clinical and counseling psychology. I interviewed 1,612 LGBT Mormons and ex-Mormons, and this is based on my published research data. And let me just finish. So you have one choice, which is to be in a mixed orientation marriage where 70% are going to fail and you're going to be likely miserable, or you can be celibate, and believe it or not, being celibate has worse depression, anxiety, and mental health outcomes as someone who's in a mixed orientation marriage. And that's why so many LGBTQ Mormons choose death.
Okay, so there's those clips. And I feel, honestly, I feel pretty bad for Timber. I don't know if Timber and I would agree on a whole lot of things when it comes to the church, but I felt like he was getting pretty ganged up on throughout the entirety of the podcast, and it was hard to watch at a lot of moments, John being like, that's a yes or no question, when like in reality questions are far more complex than a yes or no question.
Yeah.
Like we're allowed to express nuance and complexity when engaging with a question. So I felt bad for Timber, but John, as we saw, is constantly making this claim to justify his bigotry towards the LDS Church and to justify his frustration and activism against it, is basically saying the church is causing LGBTQ people to kill themselves. So therefore the church is extremely harmful. And he kind of stands on the graves of LGBTQ people to do this. I don't know, do you have a response to that very, very harmful and very scary claim towards the church? Is it accurate? What do you think?
It's not accurate at all. And here's the thing. There are tons of researchers that have every reason to express agreement with him that don't. So, for example, Michael Staley, who is the head of the Utah Department of Health, he's a gay man, not a member of the church, has said that there is no evidence that the church is causing a rise in LGBTQ suicide. So like I said earlier, there is this baseline suicide rate among the general population and among LGBTQ people. And the claim that John is making is that the church aggravates that problem that already exists. And suicide is really bad right now. It's been going up for a while. And if you read like the work of Jonathan Haidt and other psychologists, they'd say that social media plays a role. But we won't get into that. That's a tangent, but I just want to point that out. And also, some people will appeal to like Utah having really high suicide rates. I'll go into that real quick. So the reason why Utah has really high suicide rates is not because of the church. It's because it's part of this group of states called the Suicide Belt. They're mostly in the Midwest. So you have like Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Idaho, Montana, also Alaska. I don't think I named all of them, but that's like a good chunk of them. And the reason why they have such high suicide rates is because they all share a set of common characteristics that researchers have identified. And they are high elevation. There's a high percentage of white and Native American populations, which are the two racial groups that commit suicide the most in this country. There's easy access to guns. And there's also a lot of rural areas. So in these rural areas, It's a lot harder for people to get access to mental health services, and it's also a lot easier for them to feel very isolated and alone. What these states do not share in common is the LDS Church, and so you can't argue that it's the church that is ultimately causing this. So when you realize that the high suicide rates in Utah are due to much larger contextual factors that are not unique to Utah, you can't blame the high suicide rates on the church. And when you actually break it down like to Utah, you just look at Utah. When you break it down by county, you actually find that the least Mormon counties are the ones that have a bigger problem with suicide, depression, and antidepressant use. So, for example, Utah County has one of the lowest uses of antidepressants, whereas Carbon County, which is the least LDS county in Utah, has the highest. So again, when you break it down, like you can't say that there's something unique to Utah that is causing these high suicide rates. That doesn't say anything about LGBTQ people, but I just want to contextualize that because a lot of people try to use Utah as kind of this proxy for Mormonism. What Michael Staley said is also relevant. And now let's get into the actual literature. So there was a review of the literature that was published by some social scientists at BYU. It was a review of all the studies that have been conducted on Mormonism and mental health between 2005 and 2022. And it has a section where it reviews the literature, all the studies that have been conducted on LGBTQ people in the church and out of the church. I'll read the discussion section. This is where they give the synopsis of the literature. It says, much of the research on sexual gender minority Latter-day Saints begins with the premise that Latter-day Saint sexual gender minorities will have less favorable mental health than disaffiliated Latter-day Saints or those of other faiths. Findings for this, however, were mixed. Some studies found current Latter-day Saints had better mental health. Some found no difference in mental health, and others found former Latter-day Saints with better mental health. Some studies find sexual gender minority Latter-day Saints have better mental health than non-Latter-day Saint sexual gender minorities. It is relevant to note that studies with samples that are generalizable find better outcomes for sexual gender minority Latter-day Saints. So don't be confused that when they say that it's mixed. When they say that it's mixed, they're just referring to the general literature. But then they go on to say that when you restrict your analysis to the most rigorously conducted studies, the ones that have a generalizable and representative sample and a comparison group, those ones are more likely to find positive outcomes for LGBTQ members of the church. And then it says, this likely overlaps with the results of a meta-analysis that found that when samples of sexual gender minorities were drawn from sexual minority venues, such as gay bars, the relationship between mental health and religiousness tended to be non-significant or more negative. So what they're referring to is a meta-analysis conducted by Tyler Lefevre and his colleagues. Now, Tyler Lefevre is an ex-Mormon Latter-day Saint, and he's a gay man, married to a man. But unlike John Dehlin, he actually takes his job as a researcher seriously, and he doesn't let his biases get in the way. And so he's actually produced a lot of good literature that actually reflects well on the church. Now, this meta-analysis they're referring to, a meta-analysis is basically when you take like all the studies that have been conducted on a subject and you combine the results to get kind of like an average effect size. This meta-analysis was just on like the general effects of religion on LGBTQ people. It had nothing to do with the church. What it found is that studies that used what we call convenient samples, so non-representative samples, were more likely to find less favorable results for religion. And this is important because, like, they use the example of gay bars. If you just go to a gay bar or like some website, like chat room or whatever that has for LGBTQ people, the problem there is that gay people who frequent gay bars may have different attitudes, different experiences than those that don't frequent gay bars, and so therefore you have a biased sample. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with studies using this because LGBTQ people are very difficult to study. There's not very many of them. what are known as vulnerable populations. And so researchers will resort to using these bad methods because their reasoning is it's better to study them using bad methods than not study them at all. That's quite often what we're left with. However, if you can use good methods, you should. And recently there have been some good studies published that use representative samples with a comparison group. And when you use those and not the bias sampling techniques that John Dehlin and his colleagues use, you actually find better outcomes for LGBTQ people. So the synopsis goes on to say, however, when the sampling method was more general and representative, there tended to be a positive relationship between religiousness and mental health. Jana Reese compared a more representative sample of disaffiliated Latter-day Saints with a sample of disaffiliated Latter-day Saints drawn from a survey of advertised online with snowball sampling, which is snowball sampling is a type of biased sampling as well. They found the snowball sample was less diverse, more white, and more likely to have left religion and belief in God altogether. Disaffiliated Latter-day Saints in the snowball sample were more educated, with 70% college educated compared to only 21% of the disaffiliated from the more representative sample. Given education is related to mental health, snowball studies comparing former and current Latter-day Saints that do not account for education may confound education and affiliation. So the thing is, John Dehlin, he has conducted studies showing that the church has an adverse effect on the mental health of sexual minorities in the church. However, they utilize convenience samples, these bias sampling techniques. And what that study by Jana Reese shows is that, in general, when you use these sampling techniques when studying Latter-day Saints, you tend to include people who aren't representative of the population they're trying to study. Basically, in a few sentences, it includes disaffiliated Latter-day Saints who are more likely to be atheists and have an axe to grind against the church. Whereas when you use more representative sampling techniques, you get people who are more representative and they tend not to have attitudes like that. Then they go on to say, in reviewing the research on sexual gender minority Latter-day Saints, one consistent finding is that identity confusion relates to less favorable mental health. For mental health, it appears more optimal to either be connected or conversely disconnected from religiousness as a Latter-day Saint than to have mid-level involvement or experience identity conflict. Resolution of identity conflict is likely central to maintaining healthy religious connections. Feeling resolved about conflicts between religion and sexuality and being more moderate in one's views was also positively related to well-being. So, but we shouldn't be confused by this thing about identity confusion, because I know critics will be like, the church causes identity confusion, so the church is harmful. No. So what the studies show is that overall, the church, the best studies we have show that the church has a positive effect on LGBTQ members of the church. However, when these people tend to have poor mental health, it's because they are experiencing identity confusion. So the people in their samples that tend to have better mental health are the ones that are either all in, people like Timber, or people who have just completely they just kind of shucked religion to the side. They're not religious anymore. They find meaning and purpose elsewhere, and so they're not confused anymore. They've made their decision. They're gone. There's a lot of people in the middle who haven't resolved those conflicts, and those are the people that tend to have a hard time. Now, people might say that, well, the church is creating identity confusion because they're not affirming these people's desires and lifestyles. However, you can also say the same thing about John Dehlin and his camp when they argue that this non-compromising stance that, unless the church does X, Y, and Z, completely affirms their lifestyle, just caves in to everything that the radical LGBTQ lobby says, then they don't actually love you and you should leave. When they say that contributes to identity confusion too. So the best approach here is to just, here are for the church and people like John Dehlin to say, here are our perspectives, but you choose which path you want to go down, and we'll love you either way. But what we shouldn't be trying to do is like pushing our own personal views on them. What we should try to do is just try to reduce identity confusion as much as possible. And if people want to be all in with the church, then let them, because research shows that that tends to show positive effects on them. If people want to completely disaffiliate from the church and go do their own thing there, I'll say, we'll miss you, but we'll let them as well. And so that's all I have to say about that.
I think that's a great review. So if I could, again, I just like to summarize, make sure I'm understanding everything. So the review of like John making claims that the church is causing LGBTQ suicides is built upon studies that were done, where essentially it's the same thing as me going in the Thoughtful Saints Facebook group and doing a poll and gathering data from that. He's going into selective areas to gather data and ignoring the broader surveys that have been done. And when we take into account the broader surveys that have done on a wider scale, the data that on LGBTQ mental health rates in the church, although very limited, seems to suggest a positive relationship, a positive benefit to the mental health. And where we see the negative mental health isn't from just like straight exmo or straight LDS LGBTQ people, but it's people in the middle ground who are going almost through a faith and identity crisis, and that is what's causing the mental health decline. Is that accurate?
Yeah. And I want to point out there's no reason to think that if the church were to radically change its policies regarding LGBTQ people, that and marrying in the temple and everything, that their plight would change, that it would improve. Because if we just look at that sexual minorities outside of the church, they're not doing better, and in many cases they're doing worse. And many of these studies showed is that the people who are doing the worst, the sexual minorities that are doing the worst, are the ones with no religion. Whereas, and then it went like Protestant, Catholic, and then Latter-day Saints were doing the best. the one, like, it was crazy when you actually look at these studies and see what they're showing, the most rigorously conducted studies. And it showed that what was likely responsible for this was living in a supportive family with two parents, where there is little to no substance or alcohol abuse. And so, like, it's kind of a no-brainer that kids benefit from that, and LGBTQ kids benefit from that too. Mm-hmm. And so, even if the church has a socially conservative stance on this issue, their other doctrines, it's been shown to be very positive for children, and even LGBTQ children.
And like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what what freaking disgusts me is that John frequently loves to stand on the graves of LGBTQ people so he can benefit his criticism of the church. Because really, at the end of the day, I really believe that's all he cares about. He doesn't actually care about helping the church. He doesn't care about improving the LGBTQ lives in the church, as seen in a recent podcast where Gerardo and Kara, through his endorsement by publishing the episode and making it public, that they went into Charlie Bird and his husband's ward to stalk them and to spy on them to see if they were taking the sacrament, which is disgusting. Like, if someone showed up to my ward just to see if I was taking the sacrament, I would feel so freaking, like, that's just disturbing. Don't come to my ward to watch me partake in a religious ceremony. To drive out of their way up to Alpine to go and, like, stalk Charlie, it's just disgusting. And then doxing him on the podcast, which then got all the alt-right conservative LDS people on Twitter to go and attack his stake president and his bishop and Charlie and his husband. John doesn't care. Equality Utah made a statement condemning them, and then he had a meltdown and was like, "You guys are so bad for condemning me because the church is so much worse." Like, John does not care about LGBTQ Mormons. He cares about criticizing the church and harming people's faith. And so it just completely disgusts me that he frequently will stand on the graves of these people, and then he'll use the suicides from his faulty studies. He'll use that data to basically shut down conversations. So LDS people who want to engage and want to have which I desperately want to have hard conversations about LGBTQ mental health rates in the church. And I desperately want to find solutions and cultural solutions to benefit the mental health of gay Latter-day Saints. But he uses this data, this faulty data, to shut down conversations. So we don't even feel comfortable having these conversations in the first place to benefit them. And again, he's doing this just so he can benefit his criticism of the church, not because he actually cares about the mental health of these Latter-day Saints. So I don't know. You have any following thoughts?
Yeah, to be clear, John has claimed, his words not mine, that the church is causing a suicide epidemic. The church is responsible for that. So he's had, like, people haven't responded to him directly, but again, Michael Staley, who is very informed on this subject, gay man, he's head of the Utah Department of Health, has repudiated that claim. I don't know if he's repudiated John DeLynn personally, but there's all sorts of research from LDS and non-LDS researchers, including gay, ex-Mormon Latter-day Saint researchers, that have debunked what he's saying here. And so he cares so much about transparency, but he's lying to his audience.
Is there higher suicidality among atheists than there are religious people?
Among people who are like hardline atheists, no. But that it's mostly because the ones that like identify as atheists and are like it's part of their identity, they tend to be wealthy. They tend to be very well off. They're very educated, and those things tend to be a protective factor against suicide. However, people who don't necessarily identify as atheists but are just kind of non-religious and are kind of just drifting through life, those people definitely have higher suicide rates.
So if I were to start condemning anyone who criticizes the church and is kind of just non-religious and basically saying you're causing suicides by hurting people's faith, that would be really disturbing of me to do. If I was using that argument to fight against people, that would be deeply, deeply disturbing on my end. Even if I had some data to try to back it up, that's just a horrible way to engage and a very emotionally abusive and manipulative way to engage with people. And that's the exact same thing that John DeLynn, and unfortunately, and I hope ignorantly, that Jillian and Liz and some of the other ex-Mormons on this panel, that's the kind of that's the rhetoric and behavior that they're engaging in, and it's just straight up emotional abuse. It's not.
Yep.
It's not helpful.
Yep.
Yeah. Disgusting. So, you have any last thoughts on that before we carry on?
I did, and then I forgot. So, yeah, it's not coming back. So you can probably just cut this part out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good. So we'll go to the next clip and go from there.
I do not think men and women are treated equally, and it goes beyond the priesthood. It also goes to your duties as a woman. I think a lot of the time women are told, a lot of women go to BYU or college just to find a spouse, and they're told not to continue their education once they get married and to let the man take over and be the main breadwinner. So I think that there is a difference between the duties of men and women in the church.
What I love the way that you're explaining is a kid can sit in church and see who is in charge. A child can. Even being raised, becoming a teenager, you were only involved with the women. Even being all of these levels, all the way up to a level of an adult, of being married, of you can only practice your sexuality once you're married to a man. Only can you have sexual relationships once you're married to a man. It's very clear that we as women are seen very differently. And not only that, but even the concept of a heavenly mother that we talk about, they just told us that we're not allowed to pray even to a heavenly mother. We're not even allowed to, it's not brought up, we don't talk about it. And that just so clearly displays the difference of we only speak to God the Father. We don't speak to God Mother, we don't talk about her. And what's funny is it's all of the white men who are telling us why. It's always the white men who are telling
Well,
us where our level is. It's the white men who are saying, oh no, you have equal priesthood, but you can't sit on the stand, you can't pass the sacrament, you can't bless people, can't baptize people.
I'm sorry,
I
but
think it's even taking a bigger step back from even just having a position of power. But like, first of all, yes, I do think that women should be able to be a position of power. It is the whole doctrine of the church that how women are seen and how they were treated. It's bigger than just a position. It's how they are treated. It's like these are their responsibilities. This is the woman's responsibility. In the doctrine of the family proclamation, it says very clearly what a woman's job is and what a man's job is. And guess who wrote that? A bunch of white men. Did any of the women get to write that or present it? No. The men did. Do women get to even be a prophet? No, there's never been a woman prophet. And so we always have these assumptions, but it really is how women are treated in general and how they are seen of their position in the church as a whole, not just by, okay, you can be over all the women, congrats, you have a big Instagram. It's bigger than that.
All right, so there's those clips talking about some of the disagreement between men and women and their roles in the church, and if it's yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts?
So she's basically saying, I'm mad because the church doesn't align with my progressive left-wing feminism. And I don't think she realizes just how in the minority she is when you actually look at like surveys that ask women what they want in their lives, what they want in a marriage. And I think that a lot of feminists like her just kind of assume that their perspective is a lot more common than it actually is. So if we want to talk about whether the church imposes just like these rigid gender roles on women, well, let's look at what they teach, and then let's see how well like their teachings actually align with what women want when we actually look at their preferences and how they make decisions in life. So I think that the church's most authoritative position on the subject of gender roles comes from the Family of Proclamation to the World, where it says, by divine design, fathers are to preside over their families in love and righteousness, and are responsible to provide the necessities of life and protection for their families. Mothers are primarily responsible for the nurture of their children. In these sacred responsibilities, fathers and mothers are obligated to help one another as equal partners. Disability, death, or other circumstances may necessitate individual adaptation. Extended families should lend report when needed. Now, this often gets construed as like preaching this like 1950s style home life, but I don't think it does. Because it's not saying that women should only stay in the home and men should work. It uses words like primarily, which insinuates that there are primary duties and secondary duties, and that men and women are supposed to share in these duties rather than have completely separate gender roles. So, like, it's just saying that women are primarily responsible for the home life and taking care of the kids, but they can also have the secondary duty of working and having a job. Men are primarily responsible for providing, but they should also help around the home, and they have the secondary duties. Now, I'm sure even that wouldn't satisfy feminists, but let's see how this teaching actually aligns with women's preferences. Now, I'm sure critics would pull up quotes from general authorities from the 1970s and 80s that were likely responding to the feminist movement at the time, where they teach more rigid 1950s style gender roles, but you can also find quotes from Brigham Young and Gordon B. Hinckley that contain very progressive attitudes towards women's educational attainment and career seeking. We can all cherry pick quotes from church leaders and represent them as if they are the church's official position on this matter, but I'm going to bypass this problem by sticking to the proclamation since I think it is the most authoritative statement on this issue. So the question remains, are the proclamation's prescriptions overly rigid? So many feminists would argue that prima facie that since its prescriptions for women and men differ in any way, shape, or form, that this is an indication of sexism. But these same feminists also say that women's career choices or lack thereof should be respected rather than judged. So therefore, if women's preferences align with the teachings of the proclamation, then feminists are obligated to respect those preferences, even if they do not align with their egalitarian ideals. So does the proclamation teach something that is completely at odds with women's preferences? The data I've seen doesn't suggest this, so let's dive into this data. So in the year 2000, the sociologist and senior fellow at the London School of Economics, Catherine Hakim, she wrote a book entitled Work-Life's Choice Work Lifestyle Choice in the 21st Century, Preference Theory. So in her book, she argued that the wage gap between men and women was mainly a result of the different preferences between the sexes rather than the result of discrimination. She also theorized that only about 20% of women in modern societies are exclusively work-focused, whereas the majority of men are work-focused. And then she says 20% of women preferred to devote all their time to homemaking, whereas less than 1% of men are home-focused. And then the other 60% of the middle, they preferred some mix of the two. Now, this is just her theory, but then she puts this theory to the test in a 2002 study where she conducted a nationally representative study in Great Britain, which confirmed this overall pattern by showing that 14% of women are exclusively work-focused, 16% are home-focused, and the rest preferred some mix of both. Now, interestingly, she found that the full-time homemakers, they were the ones that had the hardest time meeting their preferences due to their husbands needing help paying the bills and the mortgage. Now, this was conducted in Britain, which is a much more progressive country than the US, and definitely more progressive. I think women's attitudes are more progressive than, say, LDS women. And so if we were to conduct the same study among LDS women, I think we would see it skew more towards homemaking than it would towards full-time career, although those women do exist. So, likewise, in a book by Jeff Dench entitled What Women Want, he conducted a much more recent analysis of the British Social Attitude Survey, and he reported that when women were asked outright if it's a man's job to earn money and a woman's job to look after the home and family, only about 13% agreed. However, this is not surprising because the question is phrased in a very rigid way, which would make it sound like a vote for patriarchal oppression. So when you ask women outright, do you think like, oh, it's a woman's job to stay at home and cook? Obviously, they're going to say no. However, if you ask more indirect questions, you get a much more different picture. So in this survey, this is Great Britain, which is a fairly progressive country compared to the rest of the world. He found that 69% of women think dad should be the primary earner. Only 9% think the mom and dad should share the earning responsibility equally. 0% think mom should be the primary earner. 73% think dads should work full-time. 5% think dads should only work part-time. 0% think dads should stay at home full-time. 33% think moms should stay at home until the children start school. 43% think moms should work part-time until the children start school. 28% think moms should work full-time since the kids start school. 52% think moms should work part-time after the kids start school. So if you pay attention especially to the first 3 bullet points and notice who women prefer the primary earner to be, it kind of seems like these women prefer that, quote, fathers are primarily responsible to provide the necessities of life and protection for their families. Mothers are primarily responsible for the nurture of their children. This data shows that women's actual preferences aren't too far off from what the proclamation teaches. Catherine Hakim's data also shows this trend, given that up to 86% of women prefer to either be completely or partly home-focused, whereas almost all men prefer to be completely career-focused, and less than 1% of men prefer to be completely home-focused. So, going back to Catherine Hakim's 2002 study, I've noticed that the feminists who claim that the church's teachings on gender roles are too rigid and harmful to women in general tend to fall into the group that is exclusively work-focused. So a lot of these women who are making these criticisms, they fall into that minority, like that 14% of women who are like boss babes, they have full-time careers and everything. They don't represent most women in the church or in the world, but I think they assume that their preferences are more common than they actually are, and that the church is oppressive because they impose these oppressive gender roles on women, when in reality most women want that kind of home life anyways. So I think these women are committing what is called the psychologist fallacy, where a person assumes that others think or act more or less like they do. They seem to think that because the church's teachings do not align with their preferences, then they must not align with women's preferences generally. Given that exclusively work-focused women make up such a small minority of the population, I don't think that is an accurate assumption. So that's my deep dive into the data, but just long story short, when you look at what women's actual preferences are, the church actually helps facilitate and they make it more possible for those preferences to be realized. Because I think that there are a lot of things that are the secular world kind of throws at women, like get a career and everything, get an education before you start having kids. Whereas what the church teaches, I think, is help women realize what their actual preferences are better than the rest of the world does. So that's what I have to say about that.
Awesome, and that matches my kind of observed reality. Is like I've seen so much of a trend on social media and everything of like women talking like we didn't want like this expectation of being the breadwinner to be placed upon us. Like a lot of women express desire to be stay-at-home moms, which is a perfectly good and healthy and reasonable desire. And I think it's almost like there's portions of society that like condemn women for having a desire to be a stay-at-home mom, which is wrong. Women should be a perfectly okay desire to want. And also speaking of the church, like a lot of critics of the church talk about the church in such like binaries, like women aren't allowed. They say women aren't allowed to like pursue careers, and that's nonsense. Women are 100% allowed. Like there's no church discipline or shunning or like at least in my experience. Maybe some wards you have that culture, but in my experience, there's zero shunning, zero church discipline, none of that for women who want to pursue a career. Like my wife loves her job. She loves her company. She feels like she feels fulfilled every day. She enjoys it and will probably continue to enjoy it throughout her life. And she's met no resistance or frustration for that enjoyment of her career. So I think that, yeah.
My wife would fall into that 16% of women who just want to be full-time homemakers. Because once we had my son, like I just started working a ton of overtime, and I'm the main and only breadwinner. And there are a lot of women that think like her in the church and in the rest of the world. And I think that what the church does is that it creates a lot of responsible and competent men for these women who want to get married and have kids, which makes up the vast majority of women, so that they can realize those preferences. Because in the rest of the world, like not all men are like this, but you have a lot of men that are just drifting. They just want to wait until they're like in their 30s before they get married and just mess around the entire time. Well, the reality is that most women want to have children and they want to have kids. Like that's just what the data shows. That's not me imposing a gender roles on them. And they want to be homemakers, maybe not full-time homemakers. A lot like what the data says is that they at least want like a part-time job or something. But like the church helps fulfill that by creating a lot of willing, competent, and responsible men who are willing to marry these women and provide them like to satisfy their preferences. And so I think that the church actually does a better job. And I don't see anything wrong with what Liz says when the church encourages women to get an education, but also be mothers, because like that's what most women want anyways.
Yeah. That makes sense to me. So any last thoughts on that before we move to the next one?
Nope.
All right. And we'll play this next clip. Okay, so the next one is, do you want to do the white men are bad one? Do you have a sense of thoughts, or do you want to skip that one?
I mean, I don't have a ton to say. I don't think we could just make fun of her.
Yeah. Okay, we can. I think we can just skip that one. We can just get through there's only these last couple should be pretty quick. So I think I can actually just play it for you, and you can listen to it on my phone here. That might be the easiest way to do this.
No, I'm going to be reading, what's her name? The one from Public Square magazine. I completely forgot her name.
Oh, for which one?
Megan Kohler, the one in Public Square magazine about her story. But yeah, we can, that could probably be like at the end once we're finishing up on on the whole gender roles and women thing.
Oh, gotcha. I think we're pretty much finished up there. So do you want to just do that now, and then I can edit it in at the end?
Yeah, so what were you planning on showing next?
Doctrine changing.
Ah, okay. Yeah, because I still
So
got stuff I want to
yeah, let
say
me.
about what the women thing.
Okay, yeah, let me. Yeah, we'll just continue off like it was another clip, and then I'm sure there's other clips in there that I can grab that we can piggyback off of. So, just this is just another clip talking about women in the church, and then you can go from there. Sound good?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay, so there's some more clips talking about the difference between men and women in the church. Do you have any thoughts to wrap up kind of that portion?
Yeah, I just think if you go over everything that they complained about when it came to gender and issues in the church, like my overall impression is that everything they're complaining about is just first world problems. Like I don't like I find it such an uninteresting question when there's such more important issues like I don't know sexual assault or body image issues, so which is something that like women suffer with a lot. So from that same review by Justin Dyer and his colleagues, the one that I was referencing for LGBTQ suicides, another part where they talk about women is when it comes to a body image. And one thing they said is that 4 studies examined what Latter-day Saints think about their bodies. 3 were female-only samples. Overall, research finds that Latter-day Saint women, on average, have more healthy attitudes and behaviors toward their bodies. And the more connected they are with religious belief and activity, the better their attitudes. So, that's pretty big. Another thing is sexual assault. Now, the church has gotten a lot of flack and BYU for how they've handled specific cases regarding sexual assault. However, I wrote an article in Public Square magazine in April of last year, which referenced 2 campus climate surveys that had been conducted in 2017 and 2022, and I found that these campus climate surveys show that sexual assault rates are much lower at BYU than other college campuses. BYU had a sexual assault rate of 7.4%, whereas other universities tend to have a rate of 19 to 25%. It's also important to note that around 50% of the victims in the survey reported that the perpetrator was not even affiliated with BYU. And also, given the relationship between alcohol consumption and sexual violence, victimization, and perpetration, and given that BYU is the driest campus in the country, it is likely that the word of wisdom and BYU's honor code play a large role in the low sexual assault rate on campus. So, if it's true that the church fosters this atmosphere where women are less likely to be sexually assaulted, I don't know. I think that should factor into whether women are more equal in the church than they are in the general population. That's not a first world problem. That's an actual real issue. It's much more important than whether or not the women can have the priesthood or whether or not they can sit on the stand in church. Like those just seem like first world problems when you compare them to actual issues that are relevant to women. There's also a 1997 study that found that women who have been abused, and they compared religious women, Latter-day Saint women to non-religious women, and the women who had been sexually abused as children, and they found that the religious women and the Latter-day Saint women especially had better mental health than the non-religious ones. So the Latter-day Saint religion can provide a helpful coping mechanism for women who have experienced the horrors of sexual assault. So now also to cap off the gender issues thing, like I said, I think that they're just like a perfect example of first world problems and complaining about issues that ultimately don't matter. You can be boiled down to the church doesn't align with my identity politics. It doesn't meet this checklist that aligns with my political worldview, so therefore it's bad. They're not actually showing any concrete examples of how the church actually affects women. So lastly, I'm going to read from an article by someone named Megan Kohler, and she's just talking about her experience in the church as a woman, and it's a very, very touching story. It's going to be a bit long, but I think it's worth it. So she says, in certain circles, it's become acceptable to talk about church teachings and moral norms as a kind of psychological violence that leaves people emotionally traumatized. Not infrequently do I encounter online discussions in which those who have never experienced trauma or abuse take it upon themselves to speak for victims, adopting an angry and adversarial posture towards the church as evidence of their conviction. For reasons I hope to make clear, some of their pronouncements strike me as dangerously detached from reality. Pronouncements that could only come from someone whose life has largely been shielded from the kinds of abuse and trauma that church teachings and culture largely prevent, though not perfectly, of course. Although these kinds of abuse and trauma are widespread in many parts of our society, they seem to get relatively little attention online or in popular media. As a young girl, I grew up surrounded by poverty, at times extreme, physical violence, and drugs. I don't mean the psychological trauma of sitting through an uncomfortable discussion about the law of chastity. I mean the kind where someone chokes you after you complain that their pornographic video is keeping you awake on a school night. The kind where you're living in a tent and eating condiments. The kind where you remove the car's spark plugs so it can't be used for another beer run and then hide in the garage armed with a boat paddle in case the adults discover what you did. We lived in various low-income housing, and the first time I can remember a man making me feel dirty was when I was 5, and an adult wolf whistled at me on my roller skates. I was 6 when a man in a convertible pulled up next to me and exposed himself to me. My parents divorced when I was 2, and my mother's second husband would beat her, once smashing her forehead on a faucet and punching her so hard that it tore the skin. His nephew tried to get me to touch his private parts while we played a board game in my room. Because my parents were poor, I didn't fly out to visit my biological father. I took Greyhound buses, where I spent 2 days each way playing Avoid the Predator. En route one time, a 40-something man decided that what the 12-year-old girl next to him really needed was a shoulder massage. My dating life as a teenager was an endless series of males, often 4 or 5 years my senior, doing everything conceivable, lawful or not, to try and satisfy their desires. Thankfully, my mother had impressed upon me the importance of waiting for intimacy, but occasionally the forcefulness of these encounters left me afraid for my life. The predatory males in my life came from a variety of social classes and backgrounds. Some were outcasts, some were popular, some were working class, and some were college students from stable families. Some were brazen and aggressive, but most were simply manipulative or opportunistic. They weren't necessarily malicious, they were just taking their cues and the limits to their desires from the wisdom of our wider culture. 3 of my friends had babies before we graduated from high school. All of them were abandoned by the fathers. This was fairly unremarkable in our working class community. The fault for a premarital pregnancy always rested on the women, because everyone figured that blaming a man for abandoning his responsibilities would be like blaming the clouds for making it rain. Lacking any significant external family support, because their support often consists of other abandoned women, the departure of men from these women's lives often consigns them to low-wage, menial jobs, sometimes for life. Such has been my experience of overt violence, misogyny, and trauma when at age 15 I met missionaries from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. One of the first things that drew my interest in the church was that not a single missionary made an attempt to engage with me on a sexual level. Attending church was my first experience where trustworthy males were the norm. It was an earth-shattering revelation to me that you could have a culture where men act like that consistently. All the adult males in the church treated me like a daughter, a cherished one, something that my own father had failed to do. And these experiences continued when I enrolled at Brigham Young University, where I was never once pressured for sex in 5 years of dating male 20-somethings. In those years of both casual dates and multiple long-term relationships, I was never once struck, called a name, whistled at, groped, or complimented on one of my body parts. I went on to work as a secretary for the church's family history department, where men would regularly open doors for me, chide each other for not showing me enough deference, displaying obvious biases towards my opinions and desires, and try to set me up with their sons. When I finally left Utah, it was with an elevated sense of inherent value that nothing in my childhood would suggest was possible. This was the principal point I wished to make. My childhood left me shot through with fear and shame, innumerable layers of it. I may not recover from all of it in this life. However, the healing and real happiness I've experienced so far are nothing short of miraculous. And it is largely because of my association with the church and the love bestowed on me by the good and faithful men in it. Contrary to popular perception, men in leadership capacities in my faith are not bosses, but brothers and fathers, which I desperately needed. I don't know why or how, but I know that I needed to feel this kind of love, particularly from men. Few of these men knew anything of my past, and some of them had no specific stewardship over me. But at every turn, I found myself inexplicably but genuinely loved and even adored by honorable, worthy, selfless men. I came to know God's own love, in large part through interactions with inspired priesthood leaders who became conduits for God's own pure and rationally unaccountable love that put my shame to shame. A counselor at one of my ward bishoprics drove 30 minutes each way to deliver me to seminary every morning, which began at 6 a.m. Another man in my ward, a country veterinarian, offered to pay for me to serve a mission, about $7,500 at the time, despite the fact that the church has funds to poor missionaries. A former student ward bishop has remained in my life as another father to this day, through all my tragedies and triumphs, even taking my 4 a.m. phone calls during bouts of PTSD and weeping with me when my faith began to buckle under the strain of resurfacing nightmares. I suspect one of the chief reasons why God expects so much of men in this church is because they often provide tangible examples of his own love for those who might otherwise assume he was distant or indifferent. Perhaps the greatest miracle yet has been my own husband, whose simple but unswerving sense of duty, hard work, honesty, and incomprehensible devotion have never allowed me a second's doubt that he loves me more than himself. The violence and exploitations of my past die a little more each day, overpowered by his living, breathing expression of honorable, selfless manhood. What could better blot out the memories of abandonment and abuse than this sweat and tears, his tenderness and protection, his body and soul willingly committed to me for eternity? Was he and the countless men like him in the church the products of a violent and misogynistic religion? Of course not. God is clearly the ultimate source of all love. His face moved upon the formless void of deep darkness of my life and said, "Let there be light." And there really was light. And though I searched for him, feebly at first, and then with increased earnestness as he pulled me along, I did not truly meet him until I found his church. I don't want to oversimplify. There have been good men in my life outside the church, such a wonderful stepfather who loved and provided for me. I know there are and always have been bad men within the church. Even the best ones are not perfect. And as it has been said, the dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. But the church does a remarkable job of forming men who care for women and about women. This only becomes less clear and obvious when we limit what it means to care about women to merely holding certain political or social views which are gladly held by many opportunistic and predatory men. In my experience, some political and social freedoms have come with a private price that is largely paid by the women and children who nevertheless suffer from the behavior of bad men. In contrast with my early life, the men who have really been able to care about women are those who have worked to curb their impulses, who are responsible and diligent, and who have cultivated a sense of sacredness about women and children that allows them to go beyond mere external pressures to be good and internalize the power of their influence for good. You cannot create men like this through shame, hashtags, or politics. Church teachings and priesthood responsibilities provide unique opportunities for the Lord himself to develop the spirit-deep qualities in men that enrich women's lives. I don't want people to have to live at the mercy of men whose ideas about women, sex, and responsibility were formed primarily by broken families in Hollywood. Yes, there will always be things that can improve within the church and among its individual members. I'm not asserting that anything's perfect here, or that there isn't room to improve. But in our haste for progress, let's not forget the empowerment denied to many women and children whose lives lack the stability and resources provided by caring, committed husbands and fathers. The idea that the church should be lectured by a larger culture about its violence and misogyny defies everything in my life's experience and that of many other women. Having endured my share of trauma and violence, much of it at the hands of men, I can confidently say this church has been my haven for healing.
I think that was pretty fantastic. I haven't actually read that article, so it was really cool to listen to.
It's lengthy, but I couldn't. She just makes her point so perfectly, and I just think that the conclusion we draw from here is that for women who have grown up in privileged lives in these upper middle class cul-de-sacs in the Midwest, yeah, maybe the church is misogynistic because they haven't given women the priesthood or don't let them sit on the stand. But for women like Megan, who know what true misogyny looks like, the church is a godsend for them. And you need to take into account that the church is not patriarchal, it's paternal. And it expects a lot of its men. It expects them to have self-control, to curb their impulses, like she said, and to be responsible, and be a man, and take charge, and be a provider, provide and protect. And it's very successful in creating a lot of men who take the commandment to provide and protect very seriously. And there are a lot of women who need that in their lives. A lot of women who don't have men like that in their lives. And the church provides that for people like Megan.
Yeah, I think that's great. And it gets unfortunate that sometimes, on the criticism of the church, like, it's almost like the women like Megan and many others in the church who appreciate the current setup and who like the current setup, their voices almost get tossed to the side and ignored in favor of giving women the priesthood and among other things. Like, it's like they don't care for the women who do have love the church and have the positive mental health in it. They ignore those women. That's frustrating. I'm happy, and I love to have conversations. I'd love to see in General Conference apostles' wives speaking and more and having a more equal ratio. I'd love to see women on stands and things like those things. I would love to see those things, but to obsess about it and to make your whole criticism of the church about that. I think you're right. It does come across as first world problems. Yeah.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be opposed to some of those changes either, but to argue that because the church doesn't do those things, that they are a terrible place for women, while ignoring all the things that I just named off about how they benefit women, actual real problems that really negatively affects women's lives when we don't do anything about them. When you ignore that and then complain about these first world problems, it's really hard for me to take you seriously, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree. So, all right, we'll move on. We're getting pretty deep here, but we'll move on to the next clip and go from there.
It's okay for the doctrine to change.
There's scriptural precedent for it changing, and one of the most beautiful aspects of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the fact that we have and rely upon modern prophets, and we take what they say seriously and look forward to that prophetic revelation. But at the end of the day, we still have to go home and get that same revelation. We have to get that same answer from God directly from Him that dovetails with that revelation, so that we know in our core that that is what God wants for His children. We don't have a static God.
I disagree there, because God is unchangeable, as it states in the scriptures. There are eternal principles that are eternal. They never change. But how those principles are applied can change over time. But the eternal principles remain the same, period. If we don't have any objective, solid, eternal truth, then everything is relative, and relativity leads to chaos.
We're talking about understanding God and eternal principles. I mean, we're talking about cosmic law, multi-dimensions, everything so expansive. And all of that information, part of it is being channeled through the mind of fallible people who are writing things down in a fallible language, being interpreted to people with fallible understanding.
But it's your prophets the people that you believe claim spoke to God and that I used to believe, they're the ones signing these statements. It's David O. McKay. It's people that you sustain as prophets, seers, and revelators. So how do you know when they're speaking as a man? How do you when they're excluding entire race of people from full participation? How do you know they're speaking for God or speaking for themselves until the social?
I answered.
Okay, so John, he brings up a pretty common criticism of the church, and at least of the current church, where he talks about the issue of like where members of the church are like, oh, he was speaking as a man, or oh, he was speaking as a prophet there, and like, how do you know when a prophet is speaking as a man versus speaking as a prophet? Have you encountered that criticism pretty frequently?
Yeah, I have.
So we might have different opinions on this one. My opinion personally is pretty controversial, but I believe the prophet is always speaking as a man, 100% of the time. Unless the prophet goes up there and he says, "I am dictating scripture in the same way that Joseph Smith dictated scripture," I'm not going to assume that the prophet is speaking for God. Now that's a fairly controversial, it's not a very orthodox LDS position, but it's the one that has the most logical consistency for me personally. Now it doesn't mean that I'm going to be like, oh, I don't need to value the prophet's counsel, or I'm going to throw it away, or I'm going to ignore it. It just means I'm not placing everything they say in the same standard as like the Doctrine and Covenants, Book of Mormon. I'm not placing it all in Scripture. I don't think the prophets have spoke for God, at least on a consistent basis, really since the death of Joseph Smith. Now, yeah, well, I guess we'll get into the role of what a prophet is later, but that's my answer.
What about Doctrine and Covenants 138? Because that's Joseph F. Smith. So would you make an exception for that?
Yeah, that's they specified that's scripture. So, and then now I'm not saying that like when Joseph died that heaven is dead. God never speaks to prophets. I'm not saying that at all. I'm also, I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that I believe that at the beginning of the restoration, I think it's been the same with all dispensations, God teaches correct principles that he gave to Joseph Smith. And since then, for the most part, he's allowed the church to govern itself. Now, of course, he interacts with the church from time to time, but I just can't justify this orthodox belief that God is consistently speaking to prophets in the same capacity that he was with Joseph Smith, or he's involved with the church in the same capacity as he was with Joseph Smith, because of things like the priesthood ban. I don't see that God would have corrected a prophet who almost positively would have prayed about it over the 100 years, that he wouldn't have corrected them at any point throughout that process. Other mistakes and other things I've seen in the church, I just can't justify the belief that that throughout the church history he's the same involved as he was with Joseph Smith. So when critics ask me that question, how do you know when a prophet's speaking to a man? What's the point of prophets, everything? I just say I believe prophets are always speaking as a man. Now that doesn't mean they have any value. I think they have a lot of counsel and great things to say. It just means I'm not going to place their words up there with scripture unless it's specified that they're dictating a vision, they're dictating God's voice, they're speaking scripture type thing.
Right.
No. I don't know if you have any pushback for me, but that's how I respond to that question. I know like Dan Ellsworth has different, Jacob Hansen, they all have different takes on that, but that's my take.
I do like the collective witness model. My thing is that I think you need to have an epistemology or certain tools that would enable you to be able to point out something not being right with what the general authorities are saying in real time, to where you're not just able to just in hindsight be able to say, okay, that he was speaking as a man, but here are some things that a member of the church had at their disposal at the time that Brigham Young gave the priesthood ban that they could have used to question. Another example is when leaders of the church taught that polygamy was an eternal principle and that it would never go away. Members of the church had tools at their disposal to question that, and there are many that did. If you read John Taylor's biography, there were many members of the church that wrote letters to him and said, well, what about Jacob too? What about this? And the vice president of the United States actually wrote like an article in a newspaper. His name's Schuyler Colfax, and he appealed to Jacob too, basically telling the Mormons, hey, you don't need to practice polygamy because of what this says. And so, in assessing like whether a prophet is speaking as a man, I think you can use past scripture like the Book of Mormon to measure what they're saying against that. You can also use reason. You can also use all the parts of the collective witness model. But also with the priesthood ban, I mean, Jane Manning James, she was constantly agitating the church, saying like, well, Joseph let ordained black members of the church. Now, so members of the church had tools at their disposal to question that because of what Joseph did. And so I think that you just need to come up with a certain type of epistemology that allows you to be able to question certain things that general authorities say in real time as they're saying it, and not just retroactively say like, well, anything that we don't like in the past was he was just speaking as a man, and anything we do is speaking for God.
Yeah, having an epistemology to evaluate the words of prophets. Mine is, no, I don't subscribe to a collective witness model. I have issues with it, but I think it's better than most. Mine is, I have more of like a credibility model where I think God is, where I look at where I believe God is interacting. And that's a whole different, that's another conversation for another day. But having an epistemology model for engaging with the words of prophets and scriptures is very crucial, as you mentioned, because that's where you get into issues where people start to like, if a prophet says something they disagree with, when they had the model of everything in general conference is true and correct, and then they have a faith crisis because President Nelson recommended the vaccine, that becomes like an entire, it becomes an entire issue. When in reality, like if you just have a good model to engage with the words of prophets, it can save a lot of heartbreak and frustration with the church when those things that you don't really understand come up. But yeah, that's probably longer than I needed to, but that's the how I would engage John's questions. I would share my approach to viewing prophets, and I think that they're pretty much always speaking as a man unless there's a specific dictated revelation that's coming forth as claimed by Joseph F. Smith and Joseph Smith and others.
Yeah, and I also think that like teachings, they have to withstand the test of time. They have to withstand multiple generations of apostles. Like if you just look at history, like a lot of Joseph Smith's revelations, they were not canonized until much later, even though they'd been around for a while. And so I think they just have to, there's a filter they have to go through. They kind of have to get bounced around to see if they can withstand the scrutiny of multiple apostles replacing the ones that have died. Like in the case of Doctrine and Covenants 137 and 138, those weren't canonized until 1981. And so we see that even the priesthood ban, the Adam God doctrine, the belief that polygamy would never go away in this life, those were taught briefly, but they didn't withstand multiple generations of prophets and apostles, and so they were eventually discarded. And there are probably certain things that the church is teaching now that won't withstand many different generations of prophets and apostles and will be discarded. And there probably are some things like, I think the family proclamation will one day be canonized because it has withstood the tests of time for like 2 decades now, almost. And so it'll eventually get to the point. It may or may not, that's just a prediction, but I just think that like certain teachings, especially ones that have been formalized into a document, they kind of have to be bounced around by many different generations to see if they can withstand the tests of time and the tests of the different personalities and different cultures. If they can transcend cultures changing over time, then they can be canonized, then I think that's also a good test.
Yeah, I appreciate that one. Mine is just a little bit different, but also on the family proclamation, I think it will be canonized potentially eventually, but I think has to go through, not really that any principles will be necessarily changed, but maybe some rewording I think would be beneficial. But that's just my take on the family proclamation. I think just maybe a rewrite written by the actual prophet and not lawyers, but again, that's a whole other conversation for another day.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, yeah, I don't think many of the principles will really change, if at all. But yeah. Oh, and the topic they're sitting down on, I know there was some engagement here, but they're talking about if it's okay that doctrine can change, and that's how they got into this tangent of like, when is a prophet speaking as a man? And like my take on doctrine and changing in the church and everything is doctrine is at this point today, culturally used, I think it's a pointless word in church culture that has no coherent definition, because the church and the apostles define doctrine as eternal truth revealed from God, unchanging, applicable to all people across all generations. That's how the church defines the term doctrine. Now, that's how they define it today, but if you go back in church history and see how the word doctrine is used, there's doctrines that have changed. And the church leaders have used the term doctrine, and they've used it in a way that has changed. So and then in church culture, we talk about doctrines and as things that can change and adjust, and it just becomes such an incoherent term. And I hope the church will engage with this. We're a fairly young church, and so I'm forgiving. We're like the Catholic Church has their whole list of like dogmas, right? We're a fairly young church, and we're still figuring out language and terms. But I hope they'll make an adjustment, because I feel like labeling doctrine as eternal truth revealed from God, applicable to all people, I feel like that's just kind of stabbing ourselves in the foot and isn't really that beneficial. Doctrine, I think, can and should just mean teaching. This is an authorized church teaching.
Yeah.
So that's my take.
Well, on the flip side, you have critics on the evangelical side and on the secular side who like to act like any change whatsoever in any way is a sign that that the church is just like there's no coherency, there's no logical progression or development of doctrine. Like, just show the church is just flowing with the times, which I'm not arguing that the church isn't influenced by its wider culture, but I do think that you can point out like at least a logical, if doctrine has changed, it's built off of each other in a logical way, and that it's much more coherent and consistent than a lot of critics that try to argue by just pointing out all changes in every minute detail.
Yeah. Well, cool. All right. Well, we'll play the next clip and we'll go from there.
And
but doesn't the Book of Mormon say that God cursed white people with dark skin for their wickedness? Isn't that in your scriptural canon?
It depends on your interpretation.
I've never read it that way.
What's your interpretation?
Well, there's scriptures in the Old Testament where certain individuals say there's a skin of blackness upon me that is totally symbolic of being in a state of distress. Or
Solomon, I am black but comely.
Yeah.
So what did God do to the Lamanites in the Book of Mormon in your interpretation? Did he not turn their skin dark because of their wickedness? Even though the book says that?
No, I think it was a spiritual mark. Just like with Cain, we don't know.
But it says skin of blackness in the Book of Mormon. It says skin of blackness.
It's an idiom. There are many idioms that are mistranslated.
Doesn't that feel convenient to call it an idiom?
No,
when it says skin of blackness.
Because you need to.
And when it talks about their dark skin, that God made them dark so that they'll be loathsome to the white skin Nephites?
Because if you're a biblical and Greek scholar, you realize there are idioms like this one, which is well known in ancient scripture as being a symbol of being in distress.
As a dark, can I speak?
Go ahead.
I've never read it that way. The Book of Mormon is by and large about Native Americans. And whenever we bring up the subject of race, suddenly it turns into Europeans being switched into sub-Saharan Africans. But that's not what the book is saying. When I read the Book of Mormon, I'm seeing Nephi, which is where this comes from, the cursing. Nephi hates the Lamanites. He's finding every single way to dislike them. And then his brother Jacob comes and says, hey, you should not hate them because they're darker than you. And then Samuel the Lamanite, the dark prophet, is speaking to the white Nephites. And he's saying, hey, no, you're actually cursed. And they say, let's remove him from the record. And Jesus comes in and says, put him back in the record. It's showing a history of prejudice and how to overcome it.
So what does skin of blackness mean in the Book of Mormon?
Nephi may very well believe that. Jacob doesn't. That doesn't mean it's prescriptive. That means it's descriptive.
Okay, so you're saying
To Kill a Mockingbird is racist.
You're saying Nephi was racist, but not God.
I'm saying possibly.
Okay, that's cool. That's cool.
It's effectively
That's cool.
diaries, right?
That's cool.
All right, so there's a little bit of discussion about the skin of blackness in the Book of Mormon. I talked about this. We talked about this in the last podcast on when the guy making the FBI claims briefly mentioned the skin of blackness. John is acting like taking a non-racial view of this curse in the Book of Mormon is somehow like a stretch or some sort of mental gymnastics, right? He doesn't actually say that, but you can tell by his demeanor and his language and his tone that he thinks that's an absurd argument, when in reality that's the most obvious interpretation at face value when you examine the text in context. For example, like as I talked about, Nephi comes from Jerusalem where they had the Treaty of Esarhaddon on display, which talks about if you break a covenant, basically, that God will curse you and your family with a dark black skin, as black as oil. Now that curse, the Treaty of Esarhaddon that they mentioned in there, had nothing, absolutely nothing in that context to do with race. And that curse was on display in Nephi's time in Jerusalem. So he obviously would have been aware of it. And so when Nephi and his brothers get to the New World and they break the covenant, and they break the covenant to stay in their land that was preserved from them and go and mix in with other nations to become very wicked, I believe that Nephi used the exact same imagery and rhetoric found that was on display in Jerusalem to describe the cursing of his brothers going and participating in that behavior and breaking their covenant. It fits the context practically perfectly, and when we examine the Book of Mormon, we see that practically every reference to color in the Book of Mormon is symbolic. I don't think there's really a single color in the Book of Mormon that's literal. So yeah, colors in the Book of Mormon are all symbolic. It makes sense in that Near Eastern rhetoric that the Book of Mormon comes from, that's how the curse would have been described as. I think approaching the skin of blackness as a metaphorical, as like Timber was saying, I wouldn't quite agree with Quaku's take on it, but as Timber was saying, is a very obvious reading if you read it at a level of depth. So that's my take.
Yeah, and for people like John Dehlin who believe, and all other critics that believe that the Book of Mormon is just a 19th century work of fiction, I mean, a lot of these explanations seem absurd, but for those who believe that it's actually an ancient text, in the Near Eastern or Mesoamerican text, it's a perfectly consistent argument to make within the confines of LDS theology. We believe it's an ancient text. Joseph Smith and his contemporaries all believed it was an ancient text from the Near East and ancient America. And so, like, Joseph Smith and like his subsequent prophets and apostles, they believed that the Book of Mormon was teaching like literal skin color, but that's because they didn't know much about the Near East and how they viewed like skin color and race and ethnicity. They believe that it's an ancient text, and had they known how like ancient Near Eastern people viewed skin color, they wouldn't have interpreted it that way. And so it's a perfectly like logical, consistent argument to make, to think if this is truly the text is as it claims, then how should we interpret the skin of blackness? Well, there's plenty of historical references in Mesoamerica and in the Near East that use this language, and they're using it in a metaphorical way. And so, like, perfectly logical, perfectly consistent. Saints Unscripted has a great video on that. I'd recommend anyone watch that. And also, in Brant Gardner's annotated version of the Book of Mormon, he has a really good commentary on that for 2 Nephi 5. He offers some explanations that aren't present in the Saints Unscripted video. Like, for example, he cites work by John Sorensen showing that there's certain Native American groups in Mesoamerica that have darker skin than other Native American groups, and they would quite often refer to them as having dark skin or having black skin, even if their skin wasn't black. Because they're darker than us, we're going to call them black. And so, just stuff like that. He goes into more detail about it. Maybe we can make like a video kind of diving more into the details there. and we can
Yeah,
use Brent Gardner's book. But
yeah, it's a whole conversation. But the suggestion that the non-racial, skin pigmentation reading is somehow a stretch, just is a demonstration of ignorance of the Book of Mormon and its origin and its context. So
yeah. And to add on to that, because different Native American groups in Mesoamerica, like they had darker skin than others. One hypothesis is that the Lamanites, once they intermingled with the native population, that native population had darker skin than Nephi and his people did. Even though they both, like Near Eastern people have their olive complexion, they have darker skin than say Caucasians do. But the Native Americans that Laman and Lemuel likely intermingled with had darker skin, so they started like having kids with them and everything, so that literally caused them to have darker skin, and Nephi interpreted this as a curse. So
yeah.
that's one alternative to the whole metaphorical explanation, but there are many hypotheses that have been proposed that I find to be logical.
Yeah, I think that's the one that Quaker was making. That's a pretty fairly common one. I think Jacob Hansen actually made that argument today on Facebook. I saw him make. So, yeah, it's a common one. Okay, we'll go to the next clip.
I'm saying this with as much grace as I can muster. Our beloved prophet Russell M. Nelson, he is nearly 100. I'm not kidding.
99?
He's 99. And he is running a global organization. When he was going into college, the prophet of our church at his time was still a polygamist, right? I mean, we're talking about old people that he was born before the television, the former Queen of England, and Martin Luther King, and has outlived two of those three things, okay? So again, give him grace. These people are doing the best.
But then what's the value of a prophet?
Like, do you believe he talks to God?
The value of the prophet is look at the people.
But he talks directly to God.
Sometimes,
face to face, maybe. I don't know.
But like God tells him the truths that he needs to know for the world today is what you believe.
We're talking about a beautiful cosmic entity that is Heavenly Father trying to channel information through a 99-year-old man in Salt Lake City.
But he does, yes?
Oh, yeah, to you as well.
Yeah, but
So am I a prophet?
I don't know, are you?
Okay, so there's that clip, and I think Kwaku was spitting pretty fire there for a minute. I was really agreeing with I think he was making a really good point, and actually aligns with how I view prophets, the point he was making. But then John brings up the question. I think it almost stumped him a little bit. But so what's he was talking about how we need to give prophets grace because almost like they're products of their time, right? Even though he wasn't using that phrasing, but if we look at their culture growing up, we can have a little bit of grace for some of their perspectives. And then John brings up, and they push on it, well, what's the value of a prophet? Aren't they speaking to God face to face? Why don't we expect these corrections and these changes to come quicker if he's talking to God? And I think that stumped him a little bit, but my response is pretty much the same as I had earlier. Again, I do not believe that God is consistently speaking and interacting with the church, outside of some exceptions here and there, after the death of Joseph Smith, as I expounded on earlier, and I'll probably do more podcasts in the future talking about that perspective, and we can go back and forth on it. But what I would say, what is the value of a prophet at that point, is if you don't have a prophet in an organization to lead the church, then we don't have a church. So when you ask me, what is the value of a prophet? Well, the fact that we have a church, that's the value of a prophet. If we got rid of a prophet in the Quorum of the 12s, we would just split into a bunch of different Mormon organizations planted all over the world. But to have a global church and to have someone leading and guiding it in an order of succession of 12 people going through to try to keep a consistent organization going through this last dispensation keeps the church together. It keeps it as a global organization. And if we got rid of that, we would just be Protestants, and we would just be scattered in a bunch of different Mormon sects all over the place. Yeah. That's my perspective on why we have a prophet.
Yeah, and people like to focus on how the church got these certain social issues wrong. I mean, there are many that they did get right, like giving women the right to vote before anyone else did. And Brigham Young had very progressive attitudes about women, and even with Joseph Smith, he had some fairly progressive attitudes about race. But the thing is that with the racial issue and the blacks in the priesthood, my perspective is that ever since like World War II, anti-racism has become almost this like pseudo-religion where Hitler he's the representation of Satan, and then becoming an anti-racist is like the repentance process. It's how you become a good person. And it's made it to where racism is like the cardinal sin. It's the unforgivable sin. And so it carries more weight than other sins. Whereas my perspective is that it should be seen as one sin among many. And when we analyze all sins and how the church is doing at dealing with those, I think when we look at how the church is performed in its totality, then I think it reflects well on the church. If you look the people that the church produces, that it produces a lot of happy, industrious, well-adjusted, pro-social people. And while that doesn't prove the church is true, it certainly does point it in that direction, that it is a good church. And for people who would say that that's not evidence for the church, okay, then why is harm evidence against it? If you're not going to concede that all these studies demonstrating that the church has a positive impact on society is a notch in favor of the church, then don't use harm as a notch in disfavor of the church. Like, be consistent. If the benefits don't prove the church is true, then the church promoting harmful stuff like the priesthood ban shouldn't be seen as evidence that it's not true either. In my mind, the things that prove the church true is, did Joseph have the divine experiences that he claims he had? Did he see the first vision? Were the plates delivered to him by the angel Moroni, were they translated by the power of God? That, like the historical events, did those things actually happen? And since then, like there have been a few revelations like Joseph F. Smith, but I think that mainly the church leaders have just been playing, I don't know, maintenance of what Joseph Smith created. And with the exception of like them canonizing some of the revelations like 137 and 138 in 1981, I do think that canonization is a type of revelation. But other than that, I think they're mainly just doing the best they can with the inspiration that they're ready to receive, because we're all imperfect. But that's my take on it.
Yeah, I think that's a very good and reasonable take. I wish this Jubilee discussion was on truth claims, but instead it's on social issues, which is good because you're really good at that stuff. But if it was on truth claims, you put me in, I would have a good time, because I would love to chat with any of them, John Dehlin especially. I would have a conversation about truth claims, because that's where I do my best. But
yeah, I think you would have done well on that.
Yeah. So all right, well, let's get to the last clip. I think it leaves on an uplifting note, and then we'll wrap up from there.
Okay.
The Mormon Church has done good in the world. Agreeers, please step forward.
We do a lot of humanitarian aid. We give wheelchairs out to people in third world nations. There's a lot of good we do. I would agree that I would also say, there's some things that other religions do better than us. Mm-hmm. The LDS Church does a great job helping out those who are needy.
I think the church does do a lot of great humanitarian work, and a lot of the time growing up, it was like, what can we do for our neighborhood? What can we do for our church community? What can we do for our fellow ward members? They just preach a lot of service qualities, which is great. On the other hand, I think that, I hate to say they could do more, and that's the negative, but like with all of the money that they inherit from tithing, the Mormon Church requires its members give 10% of their income before taxes to the Mormon Church, and then they utilize that money to do things, around the world, like build malls. But I think that they could do more with the money they're doing. Yes, they do a lot of good, but I think they could do even more good if they utilize that money better.
When I personally had a surgery, and I had random members that I probably haven't even met from my church. They were leaving me gifts, they were leaving me notes, they were leaving me cards. Just get well soon. Nothing huge, but it's just the thought that counts. And I didn't even have family that would leave me things like that. They're just very thoughtful people, and they're always thinking of the next guy.
For especially the ex-Mormons, would you guys say it's more of a net positive or a net negative?
For me, it's going to be more of a net positive. And I know that's kind of surprising to probably a lot of people here. I left the Mormon church just a few years ago because it didn't make me personally happy. I get to kind of sit here today in a little bit of a happy position, just knowing that like I don't really feel like I have a lot of religious trauma to speak of about my experience in the Mormon church. I feel like when I went on my mission and I was called to Houston, Texas, I got to meet some amazing people, and the things that I taught in Preach My Gospel that spoke to me, that I still know to this day are true, are all of the things that I still keep in my life, that I hold dear, that I associate, the friends that I have, the family that I keep, just all the connections that I have are within those truths that I hold dear. So for me, I'm gonna go ahead and just say it's a net positive for me, and I'm really thankful for that.
When I was in middle school, my parents got divorced, and I think my life could have gone in a lot of directions at that point. And I remember one of my Mormon church leaders has pulled me aside and he said, "John, you're a star." And so many good Mormon adult leaders rallied around me, supported me, and provided me with an amazing youth experience. And then I went on to serve a mission in Guatemala. I learned a foreign language. I spent 2 years in a developing country. And then just in my psychology training, people need identity, meaning, purpose, morality, a sense of spirituality, resolution about the afterlife, and friends and community. And one of the things that I regret is I've spent so much time trying to create secular community after being kicked out of the Mormon church, and I have not been able to do anything like what the Mormon church has been able to do. So until secular people are able to create communities that provide all those things to the secular people, I think religions like the Mormon church are going to continue to have an important place.
Yeah, I could say that a lot of the opportunities that I experienced, a lot of the mentors, a lot of the people that helped the village that raised me was within my church experience. And so my mission, I had positive experiences. I met a lot of incredible people, built a lot of good connections, but I don't know that, I know, yeah, there's humanitarian stuff, but I don't know if you can weigh that to the youth suicide in the LGBTQ community. I don't know if we can weigh that. It's just hard to weigh those things out of like, is the good better than the negative because of the spiritual trauma that it does cost, the emotional damage it does within families, within individuals. So I don't know that I could actually say which it does more of because the damage is so severe, but I know that there are positive experiences.
All right, well, there's that's the last clip there, and I actually thought that was a really cool and uplifting way to end that conversation, and I was actually really surprised, after a lot of the harshness and a lot of the harsh words that some of the ex-Mormons had for the church, that they were willing to not, I don't want to say concede, but willing to acknowledge that the church really has a net positive. And it was unfortunate that Jubilee's audience was like overwhelmingly, they were like, no, the church doesn't have a net positive, but you have all these people who are really antagonistic towards the church, and they still acknowledge that, like, as you've described throughout this video, the church does have a net positive effect on the world. So, you have any thoughts on that before we finish up?
Well, Jillian makes the point that, like, yeah, I think the church is a net positive, but I just don't know if because of all the suicide and the families they've broken apart. Well, with all the data we're going through this video, that just completely undercuts that part. So once you get rid of those drawbacks that you mentioned, you just admitted that the church is a net positive, overwhelmingly, because there is no evidence that the church is causing those things on a wide scale. You can find individual instances of that happening, and I'm sure you can find plenty of cherry-picked cases that John has on his show, on Mormon Stories, but when you look at the church's effect on people's lives in its totality, it's positive. And so I think that the ex-Mormons in the end conceded that it's positive, and the reasons they gave for having reservations about it being positive aren't valid when you scrutinize them more.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. So with that, we'll wrap up. This was a pretty long episode, but I made a lot of claims and perspectives given in the Jubilee Middle Ground episode, and I figured do it justice and respond in the best depth we can. So
Yeah, we just had a lot to say.
there you go. We have had a lot to say. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.